The trail is supposed to be a place of escape. Nature's beauty, fresh air, a break from the everyday. But what happens when a peaceful hike turns terrifying? Sometimes the wrong turn, the ignored warning, the simple bad decision can lead you down a path you can never come back from. Are you brave enough to listen? Subscribe and turn on notifications if you dare. Story 1, my name's Jake, and I've always been drawn to the unexplored. Maps, to me, were less about guidance and more about starting points. The edges, the blank spaces, that's where the real adventure began. So, when my buddy Mark and I planned our annual hiking trip, the Blackwood Forest was an obvious choice. It was vast, dense, and according to local whispers, held trails that weren't exactly on any official park map. That last part, the unofficial trails, that's what really piqued my interest. Mark, ever the cautious one, had his reservations. Dude, Blackwood's got a rep, he'd said, scrolling through some forum on his phone. People go missing there. Not like lost for a day missing, but vanish into thin air missing. He'd read aloud from a thread something about strange occurrences, unsettling sounds, and a general feeling of unease that clung to the woods like morning mist. I just laughed it off. Come on, Mark, you believe everything you read online. It's probably just bears or mountain lions. Where experienced hikers will be fine. I waved my hand dismissively, already picturing us blazing our own trail, discovering hidden vistas, maybe even a forgotten waterfall or two. Mark, though still hesitant, knew better than to argue with me when I got that look in my eye, the adventurer's calling look, as he jokingly called it. So early last Saturday, we found ourselves at the edge of Blackwood Forest. The air was different here, cooler, even though it was late summer. The trees were taller, denser than any woods I'd hiked before, their leaves a deep, almost black green that swallowed the sunlight. The official trailhead was clearly marked, a wide, well-trodden path leading into the woods. But just a few yards in, I spotted it narrow, almost invisible track veering off to the left, disappearing into a thicket of undergrowth. "That's it," I said, pointing. "That's our trail." Mark stopped, peering at the barely their path. "Jake, that's nothing. It's not even a trail. We should stick to the map." He pulled out the park map, unfolded it, and pointed to the solid green line representing the marked Blackwood Trail. "Exactly." I grinned. "That's their trail. We're gonna find ours. Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" I started towards the faint opening, pushing aside branches and stepping over fallen logs. Mark sighed, a sound that was a mix of resignation and exasperation, but followed me. He always did. The moment we stepped onto the unmarked path, it was like entering a different world. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the leaves on the main trail, seemed to vanish completely. The air grew heavy, still, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The trees here were even more twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal fingers. The undergrowth was thick and tangled, and the ground underfoot was soft and damp, like walking on a sponge. At first, it was just different, a bit more challenging, a bit more wild. We pushed through the dense foliage, occasionally having to backtrack, when the path seemed to disappear completely, only to reappear a few yards away, as if playing a game with us. Mark kept glancing back at the main trail, visible only as a faint ribbon of lighter green through the trees. "Are you sure about this, Jake?" he asked again, his voice a little strained. "Relax, man," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Truth was, even I was starting to feel a prickle of unease. The silence was oppressive. In normal woods, even dense ones, you'd hear birds, squirrels, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Here, there was nothing. Just a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed in on your ears. We walked for what felt like hours, though I couldn't be sure. My sense of time seemed to be warping in these woods. The path continued to twist and turn, leading us deeper and deeper into the forest's heart. Then, I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, though there wasn't a breath of air stirring the leaves. A faint, almost imperceptible sound like whispers. I stopped, holding up a hand to Mark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice hushed. Mark frowned, listening intently. "Hear what?" "Just the usual forest sounds or lack thereof." "No, listen." I insisted, straining my ears. There it was again, fainter this time, like voices just beyond the edge of hearing. Too soft to make out words, but definitely voices. Whispers. Mark listened again, his brow furrowed. I think I hear something, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper itself. Leak wind, maybe. No wind, I said, shaking my head. Shaking voices. Whispering. We stood there, frozen, listening. The whispers came again, a little clearer this time, swirling around us, seeming to come from all directions at once. They were just at the edge of comprehension, like someone was trying to tell us something, but their voice was too weak, too distant. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't just the cool air of the forest. This was something else, something unnatural. The unease I'd felt earlier intensified, morphing into a cold dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. We'd made a bad decision, I realized, a really bad decision. And I had a sickening feeling that the forest, or whatever was whispering in it, knew it too. Okay? Mark said slowly, his eyes wide. Okay, maybe we should turn back. His voice trembled slightly, and I knew he was genuinely scared. For once, my adventurous spirit faltered. The whispers were unsettling, yes, but it was more than that. It was the feeling, the oppressive silence, the way the trees seemed to lean in, watching us. Something about this place was profoundly wrong. Yeah, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Yeah, let's go back to the main trail. But we turned around, retracing our steps, hoping to find the faint track that had led us here. But something was different now. The path, which had been faint but discernible on the way in, seemed to have vanished completely. The undergrowth was thicker, the trees denser, and the whispers were getting louder. We turned around, retracing our steps, or at least trying to, hoping to find the faint track that had led us here. But as I said, something was different now. The path, which had been faint but discernible on the way in, seemed to have vanished completely. The undergrowth was thicker, the trees denser, and the whispers were getting louder. This isn't right. Mark stammered, his eyes darting around, his face pale. He swiveled, trying to get his bearings, but every direction looked the same, a wall of dark, silent trees and tangled underbrush. The trail was just here, wasn't it? I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot of panic tightening in my chest. Yeah, it should be. Maybe we just need to go back a little further. I tried to sound confident, but my voice wavered, betraying my growing fear. We pushed forward, or rather back, in the direction we thought we'd come from. But the woods seemed to be actively resisting us. Branches snagged at our clothes, thorns tore at our skin, and fallen logs seemed to appear out of nowhere, tripping us up. It was like the forest itself was trying to keep us here to prevent our escape. And the whispers, they were everywhere now, swirling around us like the oppressive air, no longer faint and distant, but closer, clearer. I still couldn't make out distinct words, but the tone, the intent was unmistakable. They were listening, they were watching, and they were amused. There was a mocking quality to the whispers now, a sense of dark, unseen eyes following our every move. Do you hear them? Mark whispered, his voice trembling. They're laughing, Jake. I swear they're laughing at us. I could hear it now, too, beneath the sibilant rush of the whispers, a faint, chilling chuckle, like dry leaves rustling in a non-existent wind, but with an undercurrent of something cruel, something inhuman. Just keep moving, I said, trying to sound in control, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. We need to find the main trail. It can't be that far. But with every step, the woods seemed to deepen, the trees growing taller, their forms more grotesque. They twisted into shapes that weren't natural, branches contorting like broken limbs, trunks bulging with like growths. The silence, which had been merely oppressive before, now felt actively malevolent, a heavy blanket smothering all other sounds, amplifying the whispers, the mocking laughter. The light was fading too. The already dim forest was growing darker, the shadows lengthening, twisting into monstrous shapes that danced at the edge of our vision. It was still hours before sunset, according to my watch, but here in the heart of Blackwood, time seemed to have no meaning, or perhaps it was just distorted, twisted like the trees around us. My compass, Mark said suddenly, fumbling in his pack. Maybe the compass will work. He pulled out his compass, held it level, and watched the needle spin wildly, erratically, refusing to settle on a direction. It's going crazy, he said, his voice tight with panic. It's useless. Of course it was. Why would something as mundane as a compass work in a place like this? This wasn't just a forest, it was something else, something wrong. And we were trapped inside it. Desperation began to set in. We started to stumble, pushing blindly through the undergrowth. No longer trying to follow a path, just trying to move, to escape the suffocating silence, the mocking whispers, the feeling of being watched. We called out, shouting for help, our voices raw and strained, but the forest swallowed our cries, muffling them, turning them into weak, pathetic sounds that died in the heavy air. Then Mark stopped dead, grabbing my arm, his grip like iron. He breathed, his eyes wide with terror, staring into the deepening shadows ahead. Look. I followed his gaze, my blood running cold. At first, I saw nothing but the usual tangle of trees and shadows. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw it. Or rather them. Figures, standing amongst the trees, just at the edge of the shadows, tall, gaunt figures, indistinct and wavering, like heat haze on a summer road, but undeniably figures. They were too tall, too thin, their limbs too long, their forms too wrong, just like the trees, just like the silence, just like the whispers. And they were moving. Slowly, silently, they were drifting towards us, emerging from the shadows, their forms solidifying, becoming clearer, more defined. I could see them now, not clearly, not in detail, but enough to make out their shapes humanoid, but twisted, elongated, with heads too small for their bodies, and limbs that moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, and the whispers, they were coming from them. The figures, they were the source of the whispers. They were speaking to us, or at us, or something. The whispers were louder now, no longer just at the edge of hearing, but clear, distinct, though still unintelligible as words. But the tone was changing. The mocking laughter was gone, replaced by something colder, something hungrier, something expectant. Run, I croaked, my voice barely audible, my throat suddenly dry and tight. Mark, run. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes, not caring, just running blindly, desperately, away from the figures, away from the whispers, away from whatever this place was. I could hear Mark behind me, his breath ragged, his footsteps heavy, uneven. We ran together side by side for what felt like an eternity. The forest a blur of dark green and deeper shadow around us, the whispers chasing us, pressing in on us, the sound of our own panic breathing, the only other sound in the suffocating silence. But we weren't getting away. I could feel it. The figures were still there, somewhere behind us, still moving, still whispering. And now I could hear something else too, a new sound, beneath the whispers, beneath our ragged breathing, a sound that made my blood run colder than ice. Footsteps, not ours. Too light, too quick, too many. Footsteps surrounding us, closing in, moving through the undergrowth with impossible speed, impossible silence, except for the faint, rustling sound of dry leaves, and the whispers, always the whispers, growing louder, closer, more insistent. We were surrounded, trapped, listened to. And whatever was listening, whatever was whispering, was closing in. The footsteps were all around us now, rustling through the dry leaves, circling us like predators closing in on their prey. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus, a sibilant symphony of malice that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I spun around, trying to see through the gloom to catch a glimpse of our pursuers, but the shadows were too deep, the trees too dense. I could sense them, though, just beyond the edge of sight, moving, waiting, listening. Mark and I stood back to back, panting, our eyes wide with terror, scanning the darkness. What are they? Mark choked out, his voice barely a whisper itself, mirroring the sounds that surrounded us. What do they want? I had no answer. I didn't know what they were or what they wanted. All I knew was that they were here, they were close, and they were not friendly. They were the embodiment of everything wrong about these woods, the source of the oppressive silence, the mocking laughter, the feeling of dread that had clung to us since we'd foolishly strayed from the marked path. We have to fight, I said, my voice trembling but firming with a desperate resolve. We have to try something. It was a pathetic plan born of sheer panic, but standing still, waiting to be taken, was not an option. We grabbed the thickest branches we could find from the forest floor, wielding them like clubs, pathetic weapons against an unseen, unknown enemy. It was a futile gesture, I knew, But the act of arming ourselves, of preparing to fight, gave us a sliver of courage, a momentary defiance against the encroaching darkness. Ready? I asked Mark, my voice hoarse. He nodded, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the shadows that danced between the trees. Ready as I'll ever be, we charged. A blind, desperate rush into the darkness, towards the rustling leaves and the whispering voices. We swung our branches wildly, thrashing at the undergrowth, yelling, trying to scare away whatever was out there. Trying to break through the circle that was closing around us. It was useless. Our branches met only air, leaves empty shadows. There was no resistance, no impact, no sound of anything being struck. It was like we were fighting ghosts, shadows, the very air itself. And the footsteps, they didn't falter, didn't retreat. They just kept coming, closer, faster, surrounding us completely now. The whispers intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo, a chorus of sibilant voices that seemed to pierce our minds, not our ears. Then, they emerged, from the shadows, from behind the trees. They stepped into the dim light, and I finally saw them, truly saw them, and the sight was far more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. They were tall, impossibly tall, their bodies gaunt and elongated, their limbs spindly and too long, moving with jerky, unnatural fluidity. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. And their eyes were black, utterly black, pupil and iris indistinguishable, like empty sockets staring out from the depths of shadow. They wore no clothes, but their bodies were not entirely bare. Twisted branches, thorny vines, and clumps of moss seemed to grow directly from their skin, like grotesque, organic ornaments. And their heads were small, too small for their bodies, and oddly shaped, elongated and pointed, with mouths that were just thin, leapless slits, and noses that were barely more than two narrow openings. They were not human, not animal, not anything I could recognize or understand. They were of the woods, extensions of the forest itself, given grotesque mobile form. And they were many, dozens of them, maybe more, surrounding us in a silent, watchful circle, their black eyes fixed on us, their lepless mouths moving, emitting the whispers that had haunted us through the woods. The whispers were no longer just whispers now. As the figures emerged, the whispers coalesced, solidified, becoming words. Not words I understood, not in any language I knew, but words nonetheless resonant and chilling, vibrating in the air, in my skull, in my very soul. They were speaking to us. The figures. The creatures of Blackwood Forest. They were whispering to us, and now they were speaking. And as they spoke, I began to understand, not the words themselves, but their meaning, their intent. They were speaking of the forest, of themselves, of us, of what we had done. We had strayed, we had trespassed, we had taken the wrong trail. And the forest did not forgive. It listened to those who entered, and it remembered those who strayed, and it collected those who were lost. That's what they were, I realized with a dawning horror. Collectors. Guardians of the wrong trails, listeners in the deep woods, gatherers of lost souls. And we were lost, utterly irrevocably lost. The figures began to move again, slowly, deliberately, closing the circle, their spindly limbs gliding through the undergrowth with impossible ease, their black eyes never leaving us. The whispers, their voices, grew louder, more insistent, no longer mocking, no longer amused, but welcoming. Welcoming us to the forest, welcoming us to stay. Forever. Mark screamed. A raw animal sound of pure terror, and he lunged forward, not at the figures, but away from them, breaking through the circle, running blindly into the deeper woods, away from me, away from everything. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, watching him go, watching the figures turn their black eyes towards him, watching them glide silently after him, their whispers rising in pitch, becoming almost gleeful. I should have run too. I should have followed Mark, or run in the opposite direction, or done something. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by terror, by the sheer, unadulterated horror of what was happening. The figures turned back to me, their black eyes focusing on me, again, their lepless mouths moving, whispering, speaking, welcoming, collecting, listening for me. And as they closed in, as their gaunt, shadowy hands reached for me, as the whispers enveloped me completely, I understood. This was it. This was the end of the trail, the wrong trail, and there was no turning back. The forest had listened, and now it had listened for me. Story 2, my name is Ashley, and if there's one thing I pride myself on, it's experience. Years of hiking, backpacking, and navigating trails from the Rockies to the Appalachians have given me a certain confidence. Some might call it arrogance, but I prefer to think of it as earned expertise. So, when my girlfriend, Emily, suggested a weekend hike up Hemlock Mountain, I immediately started planning, pulling out maps, checking weather reports, and mentally running through my gear list. Hemlock Mountain wasn't exactly wilderness, more like a popular state park, but it had some decent elevation, promised good views, and was only a couple of hours' drive. Perfect for a quick getaway. Emily, bless her heart, was less outdoorsy than me, but she was always game for an adventure, especially if it involved getting away from the city and spending time in nature. We arrived at the park entrance early on Saturday morning, the air crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. We checked in at the ranger station to get trail maps and any last-minute updates. The ranger, a woman with kind eyes and a worn uniform, greeted us with a friendly smile. Hemlock Mountain. Good choice, she said, handing us a map. The trails are in great condition right now. You heading up to the summit? That's the plan, I replied, nodding. Summit Trail. Loop back down via Overlook Trail, da. Sounds good, she said, her smile fading slightly, a hint of concern entering her voice. Just be aware of the fog rolls. They can come in suddenly up there, especially in the afternoons. Visibility can drop to near zero in minutes. I chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. Fog. We're prepared. We've hiked in fog before. Got compass, GPS, extra layers, the works. We'll be fine. My tone was light, almost joking, but underneath, there was a sliver of that earned expertise arrogance creeping in. Fog was for amateur hikers, for unprepared day trippers. Not for someone like me. The ranger's smile didn't quite return. It's not just any fog, Mom, she said, her voice lower now, more serious. Hemlock fog is different. It's thick, disorienting, and it can linger for hours. Just be careful, okay? And if you see it rolling in, turn back immediately. Don't try to push through it. Sure, I said, still dismissive, already mentally moving on to the hike itself. We'll keep an eye out. Thanks for the heads up. I took the map, gave Emily a reassuring wink, and we headed towards the trailhead. As we started up the summit trail, the ranger's words faded from my mind, replaced by the immediate pleasures of hiking, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the scent of pine and damp earth, the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Emily, initially a bit quiet, soon relaxed into the rhythm of the trail, her initial apprehension replaced by a growing enthusiasm. The first part of the hike was easy, a gentle incline through a mixed forest of hardwoods and evergreens. We chatted, laughed, pointed out interesting plants and birds. Enjoying the perfect weather and the solitude of the trail, the ranger's fog warning seemed almost comical now, the sky above us a vast expanse of clear, bright blue. As we climbed higher, the terrain started to change. The trail became steeper, rockier, wending through stands of hemlock trees, their dark green needles casting deep shadows even in the midday sun. The air grew cooler, and the forest took on a different character, more somber, more brooding. We stopped for lunch at a rocky outcrop, with a partial view through the trees, eating sandwiches and trail mix, rehydrating with water. As we ate, I glanced back down the trail, noticing how quickly we had climbed. The parking lot, where we had started just a couple of hours ago, was now a tiny speck in the distance. Beautiful, isn't it? Emily said, leaning back against a rock, her face flushed with exertion and pleasure. Yeah, it is, I agreed, though my gaze was drawn not to the view, but to the sky behind us. In the distance to the west, a bank of clouds was starting to build, low and gray, clinging to the horizon like a shroud. It was still far away, barely noticeable, but something about its color, its density, sent a faint prickle of unease down my spine. Clouds are rolling in, I said, pointing. Might get some afternoon showers later. I tried to sound casual, but Emily, always perceptive, caught the slight change in my tone. Showers, she said, her brow furrowed. The ranger didn't mention rain, just fog. Yeah, fog, I said quickly, too quickly. Probably just some high clouds, nothing to worry about. Let's keep moving. We want to reach the summit before the view gets clouded over. I rushed the last part, hoping she wouldn't notice my slight hesitation. We packed up our lunch things and continued upwards. the trail now climbing steeply through a dense hemlock forest. The trees were so thick here that the sunlight barely penetrated, and the air was still and heavy, almost suffocating. The cheerful sounds of the forest had faded, replaced by a deep, pervasive silence, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of our boots on the rocky trail. And then it started. Not rain, not yet, but a subtle shift in the air, a dampness. A coolness that wasn't just the mountain air. The light began to dim, the shadows deepening, and a thin, wispy haze began to drift through the trees, clinging to the needles of the hemlocks like ghostly cobwebs fog. It was starting to roll in just as the ranger had warned, but it was still thin, barely noticeable, more like a light mist than a dense fog, and we were so close to the summit now, I could almost feel it, sense the open space, the panoramic view that awaited us. Almost there, I said, forcing a cheerful tone, ignoring the growing knot of unease in my stomach. Just a little further, and we'll be at the top. Emily glanced back at the thickening haze behind us, her expression troubled. Ashley, she said hesitantly, maybe we should turn back. The ranger said, be careful. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. And we are being careful. It's just a little fog, Emily. We're not going to turn back now, not when we're this close. Come on, let's just reach the summit. Take a quick look, and then we can head down, okay? Emily hesitated for another moment, her eyes searching mine, then sighed in resignation. Okay, she said, her voice quiet. But if it gets any thicker, it won't, I said, with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. I'll probably burn off as soon as we get to the top. Mountain fog, you know how it is. Another dismissive wave of my hand, another attempt to minimize the warning, to ignore the signs that were starting to accumulate around us. We continued climbing, the fog thickening with every step, the visibility decreasing, the silence deepening. The wispy haze was now a dense, swirling mist obscuring the trail ahead, swallowing the trees around us, turning the world into a gray, muffled void. And then we heard it, a sound faint and distant at first, but growing steadily louder, a low, rhythmic drumming like a heartbeat, slow, deep, and resonant, echoing through the fog-shrouded woods. And then we heard it, a sound, faint and distant at first, but growing steadily louder, a low, rhythmic drumming, like a heartbeat, slow, deep, and resonant, echoing through the fog-shrouded woods. The sound resonated not just in our ears, but in our chests, a deep, primal thrumming that vibrated through the very ground beneath our feet. It was unsettling, deeply so, a sound that felt wrong, out of place in the natural silence of the mountain. What is that? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing drumming. She stopped dead on the trail, her eyes wide, searching the swirling fog around us, her face now completely drained of color. I frowned, straining my ears, trying to identify the source, the nature of the sound. I don't know, I admitted, my own voice hushed. Maybe construction. Some kind of machinery. It sounded weak, even in my own ears, a flimsy attempt to rationalize the irrational. There was no construction on Inlock Mountain, not this far up, not in this wilderness. And this didn't sound like machinery. It sounded organic, alive, yet utterly alien. The drumming grew louder, closer, more insistent, the rhythm slow and steady, like a massive, ponderous heart beating in the depths of the fog. It seemed to be coming from all directions at once, surrounding us, enveloping us, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. It's getting thicker, Emily said, her voice trembling now, gesturing to the fog that was swirling around us, now truly dense, a white, impenetrable wall that had swallowed the trees, the trail, everything. Visibility had dropped to just a few feet, maybe less. We were adrift in a gray, muffled world, the drumming our only constant companion. Okay, I said, trying to project an air of calm I definitely didn't feel. Okay, this is getting a bit intense. Maybe we should turn back now. The ranger did warn us, after all. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, a bitter admission of my earlier arrogance, my dismissal of the ranger's warning. Pride, it seemed, was a luxury we could no longer afford. Emily nodded eagerly, relief flooding her face. Yes, please, Ash, let's go back. This is freaking me out. Right, I said, turning to retrace our steps, or what I thought were our steps. But the trail was gone. completely vanished, swallowed by the fog, erased from existence. We were standing on a bed of damp leaves and rocks, surrounded by a swirling white void, with no discernible path in any direction. "The trail," I said, my voice faltering, the carefully constructed facade of calm starting to crumble. "I can't see the trail anymore." A panic flared in Emily's eyes, mirroring the icy dread that was now gripping my own heart. "What do you mean you can't see it?" "It was just here. We were just on the trail." I know, I said, trying to keep my voice steady to push back the rising tide of fear. "It's just the fog is so thick. It's probably just obscured. We just need to get our bearings. Which way is back?" I turned in a slow circle, trying to remember the direction we had come from, but it was hopeless. Everything looked the same, a featureless white void, broken only by the vague, looming shapes of trees swallowed by the fog. The drumming continued, a relentless, rhythmic pulse that seemed to disorient, to confuse, to rob us of our sense of direction. "I don't know," I admitted, the words heavy with dread. "I can't tell which way is back. Everything looks the same." Emily's breath hitched, a small, panicked sound in the muffled silence. "We're lost," she whispered, the question hanging in the fog, laid in air like a death sentence. No, not lost," I said quickly, desperately trying to reassure myself. "Just disoriented. Temporarily disoriented. We have the compass, remember. We can use the compass to find our way back." Another flimsy reassurance. Another desperate grasp at rationality in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond reason. I pulled out my compass, the same compass I had so confidently boasted about to the ranger, the symbol of my preparedness, my expertise. I held it level, just as I had practiced countless times, and watched the needle spin wildly, erratically, just like Mark's compass in the Blackwood Forest story I had read online just days ago, stories I had dismissed as internet nonsense. Now, here in this fog-choked wilderness, the compass needle danced like a thing possessed, refusing to settle, refusing to point north or south, or any direction at all. "The compass," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "It's not working. Just like in those stories, the ones you said were just internet nonsense." Her voice was true too, laced with a fear that mirrored my own dawning realization. "It's magnetic interference." I stammered, grasping at straws, desperately trying to find a logical explanation. Anything to cling to in the face of the mounting dread. Maybe there's some kind of mineral deposit in the rocks, messing with the compass. It happens sometimes. But even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow, meaningless. This wasn't magnetic interference. This was something else, something far more profound, far more unsettling. This was the fog, the Hemlock Mountain fog, the fog the ranger had warned us about, the fog that was different. And in that moment, the drumming changed. It didn't just get louder, it changed its rhythm, becoming faster, more erratic, less like a heartbeat, more like a frantic pounding, a panicked pulse, accelerating, intensifying, driving a spike of pure terror through my heart. And then Emily screamed. A sharp, piercing shriek that cut through the muffled silence of the fog, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, my branch weaponataju, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Emily, what is wrong?" She was pointing, her arm outstretched, her finger trembling, pointing into the swirling white void behind me, her eyes wide with a terror that reflected something she was seeing in the fog, something I couldn't yet see. "Dear," she gasped, her voice choked with fear. "Behind you. I saw figures, moving in the fog." Tall and white like light ghosts. I whirled around, my senses straining, my eyes searching the fog, trying to pierce the swirling white curtain to see what had terrified Emily so completely. And then I saw them too. At first, just vague shapes, indistinct forms moving at the edge of visibility, pale and wavering in the fog, like tricks of the light, illusions created by the swirling mist and my own panicked imagination. But as they moved closer, as the drumming intensified, as the whispers started again, faint and sibilant, weaving through the rhythmic pounding, the shapes solidified, became clearer, more defined. Figures. Tall, gaunt figures, just like in the Blackwood Forest stories, just like in my darkest nightmares. But these weren't shadowy or indistinct. These were pale, almost luminous in the fog. their forms stark and clear against the white void. They were tall and slender, with elongated limbs and heads that were small and featureless, like smooth white eggs perched atop impossibly long necks. They white, pure white, bone white, fog white, their skin, their forms, blending seamlessly with the swirling mist, making them seem to materialize and dematerialize with the shifting fog like phantoms born of the mist itself. And they were moving towards us. Slowly, silently, inexorably, drifting through the fog like wraiths, their white forms gliding over the ground without sound, without apparent effort, drawn to us by the drumming of our hearts, by the whispers of the wind, by something else, something unseen, something listening. I saw them too. At first, just vague shapes, indistinct forms moving at the edge of visibility, pale and wavering in the fog, like tricks of the light, illusions created by the swirling mist and my own panicked imagination. But as they moved closer, as the drumming intensified, as the whispers started again, faint and sibilant, weaving through the rhythmic pounding, the shapes solidified, became clearer, more defined. Figures. Tall, gaunt figures, just like in the Blackwood Forest stories, just like in my darkest nightmares. But these weren't shadowy or indistinct. These were pale, almost luminous in the fog, their forms stark and clear against the white void. They were tall and slender, with elongated limbs and heads that were small and featureless, like smooth white eggs perched atop impossibly long necks. And they were white, pure white, bone white. Fog white, their skin, their forms, blending seamlessly with the swirling mist, making them seem to materialize and dematerialize with the shifting fog, like phantoms born of the mist itself. And they were moving towards us, slowly, silently, inexorably drifting through the fog like wraiths, their white forms gliding over the ground without sound, without apparent effort. Drawn to us by the drumming of our hearts, by the whispers of the wind, by something else, something unseen, something listening. Emily's scream still echoed in the fog-choked air, but she was silent now, frozen beside me, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures, her body rigid with terror. I too was paralyzed for a moment, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, to reconcile the rational world I knew with the impossible horror unfolding before me. But the drumming, the relentless, pounding drumming, jolted me back to a semblance of action. We couldn't stand here frozen, waiting for whatever those things were to reach us. We had to move, to run, to do something, anything to escape. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Emily's arm, pulling her forward, away from the approaching figures, back in the direction we thought we had come from, though direction seemed meaningless in this fog-bound world. "Run, Emily. Run for your life." We stumbled through the fog, crashing blindly through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, rocks tripping us up, our breath coming in ragged gasps, the drumming pounding in our ears, the whispers swirling around us, and now a new sound, a soft, rustling sound like dry leaves skittering across the ground, the sound of the white figures gliding silently in pursuit. We ran and ran for what felt like miles, though it was impossible to judge distance or time in this disorienting fog. The white figures remained behind us, always just at the edge of visibility, always keeping pace, never gaining, never losing ground, just following, pursuing, listening. And the drumming, it never stopped, never faded, but grew steadily louder, more insistent, more frantic, until it seemed to fill the entire world, to drown out all other sounds, to become the only reality, the only constant in the swirling white void. Then, Emily stumbled. Her foot caught on a root hidden beneath the leaves, and she went down hard, crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. Emily, I yelled, skidding to a halt beside her, dropping my branch weapon, kneeling down to help her up. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" she gasped, clutching her ankle, her face contorted with pain. "On my ankle, I think I twisted it. I can't walk." Her voice was choked with tears, with pain, with terror. My heart sank. We were trapped. Lost, injured, and pursued by those things. The ranger's warning echoed in my mind, mocking my arrogance, my dismissal of her words, my foolish confidence in my own experience. We had ignored the signs, and now the mountain was claiming its due. I looked back through the swirling fog and saw them, the white figures, closer now, much closer, emerging from the mist like phantoms rising from a spectral sea. They were no longer indistinct shapes. I could see them clearly now, their smooth, white faces, featureless except for the black pits where their eyes should be, their thin, lipless mouths slightly open, emitting the constant, sibilant whispers. And I saw their hands, long, spindly hands with fingers that were impossibly elongated, tipped with sharp, bone-white points like needles, like claws. And they were reaching for us, reaching through the fog, their white forms gliding effortlessly over the ground, drawn to us, to Emily's cry of pain, to our fear, to our desperation. "We have to go," I said, my voice urgent, desperate. "Emily, you have to try. We can't stay here. They're coming." I tried to lift her, to pull her to her feet, but she cried out in pain, her ankle clearly unable to bear weight. "I can't, Ashley. I can't." She sobbed, her voice breaking. Just go. Save yourself, leave me." "No," I said fiercely, refusing to even consider it. "I'm not leaving you. We're in this together. We'll get through this together. Come on, lean on me, we'll go slowly. Just try." I put my arm around her, supporting her weight, trying to help her stand, but it was no use. Her ankle was too injured, too painful. She couldn't walk, not even with my help. We were trapped. The white figures were almost upon us now, just yards away, their silent forms gliding through the fog, their whispers now a deafening chorus, their black eyes fixed on us, their needle-fingered hands outstretched. And then the drumming stopped. Abruptly, completely, as if a giant heart had suddenly ceased to beat. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before, a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the sibilant whispers of the white figures and our own ragged breathing. In the sudden silence, the whispers became clearer, more distinct, no longer just a chorus of sibilant sounds, but individual voices, whispering words I could almost understand, words that seemed to resonate with a dark, ancient power. They were whispering our names. Ashley, Emily. Faintly at first, then louder, clearer, closer, until it seemed like the fog itself was speaking our names. The trees were whispering our names. The very mountain was calling us, welcoming us, claiming us. Ashley, Emily listened, ignored signs. The whispers coalesced into fragmented phrases, chillingly comprehensible. It coined the ranger's warning, mocking my arrogance, confirming our doom. Listened, ignored signs taken. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The white figures closing the final distance, their needle-fingered hands reaching for us, their black eyes burning into our souls. And in that moment, as the white figures reached us, as their cold, skeletal hands closed around us, as the fog enveloped us completely, swallowing us whole, I understood the final, horrifying truth. We hadn't just ignored the signs of the fog. We had ignored the signs of the mountain itself. We had ignored the whispers of the woods, the warnings of the ranger, the unease in the air, the unnatural silence, the drumming in the fog. We had ignored everything, blinded by our arrogance, our overconfidence, our foolish desire to reach the summit, to conquer the mountain. And the mountain had listened. It had listened to our footsteps on its trails, to our voices in its forests, to the drumming of our hearts as we climbed higher and higher, ignoring its warnings, trespassing on its secrets. And now, the mountain was taking us, collecting us, adding us to its silent, white collection, lost souls claimed by the fog, forever bound to Hemlock Mountain, forever listening to the whispers, forever becoming part of the signs we had so foolishly ignored. Story 3, they call me Ben, and I'll admit it, I'm always looking for the angle. The faster route, the smarter way, the shortcut. Life's too short to take the long way around, right? That's been my motto anyway. Sometimes it pays off, sometimes well. Sometimes you end up somewhere you really shouldn't be. This particular time, it was supposed to be a simple weekend hike with my usual group: Liam, Sarah, and Chloe. We've been hiking together for years, exploring trails all over the state. This time, we'd picked Rattlesnake Ridge. It's not exactly a challenging hike, more scenic than strenuous, but the views from the top are supposed to be incredible, especially at sunset. The trailhead was bustling when we arrived on Saturday morning. Rattlesnake Ridge is popular, especially on weekends. We squeezed into a parking spot and joined the stream of hikers heading towards the trailhead sign. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather, and everyone was in good spirits, chatting and laughing as we set off. The main trail was wide and well maintained, winding gently uphill through a typical mix of oak and pine forest. It was pleasant enough, but honestly, a little boring for my taste. Too many people, too predictable, too on the map. I like a little more adventure. We hiked for about an hour, the trail gradually climbing higher, the sounds of other hikers fading behind us as we spread out along the path. Liam and Sarah were in the lead, chatting about some new backpacking gear they were considering. Chloe was a bit further back, listening to music on her headphones, occasionally pausing to snap photos of wildflowers. I was bringing up the rear, my mind already wandering, always searching for that angle, that shortcut, that something more. And then I saw it. Just off to the side of the main trail, almost hidden by a cluster of ferns and low-hanging branches, was a faint opening in the undergrowth. It wasn't much, just a narrow gap in the bushes, but something about it caught my eye. It looked like a path. Not an official trail marked on any map, but a path nonetheless, barely visible, overgrown, but undeniably there. My shortcut senses started tingling. I stopped, pretending to adjust my backpack, while I studied the faint opening more closely. It definitely looked like a trail, or at least the remnants of one. The undergrowth was slightly flattened, the leaves disturbed, and I could just make out a faint track wending into the deeper woods, away from the main Rattlesnake Ridge trail. "Hey guys, hold up a sec," I called out, jogging forward to catch up with Liam and Sarah, who had paused further up the trail, waiting for Chloe to catch up. "What's up, Ben?" Liam asked, turning back, his brow furrowed with mild impatience. Liam is a stickler for sticking to the plan, for following the map, for doing things the right way. Shortcuts are definitely not his thing. "I think I found a shortcut," I said, pointing back down the trail towards the faint opening in the bushes. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "A shortcut. Ben, we're on a trail. That's kind of the definition of a shortcut." No, not a shortcut on this trail," I explained, gesturing towards the faint opening again. "A shortcut to the top. Look, I think this is an old path, maybe an old logging trail or something. It looks like it heads straight up the ridge. Could cut off a good chunk of the specks on the main trail." Liam frowned, pulling out the trail map from his pack. He unfolded it, studying it intently, his finger tracing the solid red line of the Rattlesnake Ridge Trail. "I don't see any other trails marked here, Ben. Just the main loop." "Exactly," I said, my voice laced with that familiar, irresistible enthusiasm. "That's why it's a shortcut. It's not on the map. It's undiscovered. Come on, think about it. We could get to the top faster, beat the crowds, have the summit all to ourselves for lunch. Remember adventure." Sarah and Chloe exchanged glances, a flicker of hesitant interest in their eyes. Chloe, always up for something different, was already starting to look intrigued. Sarah, more practical, was still wavering, but I could see the lure of the undiscovered, path starting to work its magic. Liam, predictably, was still skeptical. "Ben, I don't know, we should probably stick to the marked trail. It's safer. We don't know where that other path leads. It could be overgrown, dangerous, lead us completely off course." "Come on, Liam, lighten up a little," I said, rolling my eyes, trying to dismiss his concerns. "It's just a little detour. What's the worst that could happen? We're experienced hikers. We can handle a little off-roading." I grinned, flashing my most persuasive, "Trust me, this will be awesome" smile. Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly still unconvinced. I don't like going off trail, Ben. Especially on a trail we don't know anything about." "We'll be fine," I insisted, already starting to move towards the faint opening in the bushes. "We'll stick together, keep an eye on our bearings, and if it gets too rough, we can always turn back." "But what if it's amazing? What if we discover some hidden viewpoint, something no one else on the main trail ever sees? Don't you want to find out?" I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the conflict between his cautious nature and the nagging pull of curiosity. He knew me too well. He knew that once I got an idea in my head, especially a shortcut idea, I wasn't likely to let it go easily. Finally, he sighed again, a sound of resignation more than agreement. "Fine," he said, his voice grudging. "Fine, Ben, we'll try your shortcut. But if it gets sketchy, we're turning back. No arguments, DL, I said, grinning triumphantly. "You won't regret this, Liam. Adventure awaits." I pushed aside the branches, stepped through the opening, and plunged into the unknown path, my shortcut senses tingling with anticipation. Sarah and Chloe followed, their initial hesitation replaced by a shared sense of excitement. Liam, bringing up the rear, still looked unconvinced, his brow furrowed, his eyes scanning the woods around us with a wary apprehension. As we stepped off the main trail and onto the faint, overgrown path, it was like crossing a threshold. The sounds of the other hikers, the cheerful chatter and laughter, faded abruptly, swallowed by the denser woods. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the leaves on the main trail, seemed to dim, replaced by a deeper, more pervasive shade. The air grew still cooler, and a subtle shift in the atmosphere settled around us, a feeling of isolation, of being cut off from the familiar world, of venturing into something different. As we stepped off the main trail and onto the faint, overgrown path, it was like crossing a threshold. The sounds of the other hikers, the cheerful chatter and laughter, faded abruptly, swallowed by the denser woods. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the leaves on the main trail, seemed to dim, replaced by a deeper, more pervasive shade. The air grew still cooler, and a subtle shift in the atmosphere settled around us, a feeling of isolation, of being cut off from the familiar world, of venturing into something different. The shortcut, if it could even be called that, was barely a path at all. It was narrow, overgrown with weeds and ferns, and littered with fallen branches and decaying leaves. We had to watch our footing carefully, stepping over logs, ducking under low, hanging branches, pushing through thickets of thorny bushes that snagged at our clothes and scratched at our skin. "Are you sure this is even a trail, Ben?" Sarah asked, her voice a little strained as she tripped over a gnarled root hidden beneath the leaves. "It doesn't look like anyone's used this in years." "Relax, Sarah, it's fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Truth was, even I was starting to have second thoughts. The shortcut wasn't exactly proving to be shorter or easier. It was steeper, rougher, and definitely more unsettling than the main trail. But I wasn't about to admit I might have been wrong, not yet. It's just overgrown. It'll probably clear up further ahead. Liar, pants on fire, my inner voice muttered. We continued to push onward and upward, the path wending and twisting through the increasingly dense forest. The trees here were older, larger, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The undergrowth was even thicker, a tangled mess of vines and bushes that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves under our boots and the sound of our own breathing. The cheerful birdsong and forest sounds of the main trail were completely absent here. "It's really quiet," Chloe said, pulling off her headphones, her brow furrowed. "Too quiet, almost. It's kind of creeping me out." Chloe, usually the most laid back of our group, was starting to look genuinely uneasy. "It's just the deep woods, Chloe," Liam said, trying to reassure her, though his own voice sounded a little strained. "It's always quieter off the main trails. Probably just means we're getting away from the crowds, like Ben wanted." He shot me a look that was a mix of exasperation and "I told you so." We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn path and the increasingly rapid beating of my own heart. The unease was growing, settling over me like the heavy shade of the forest, a cold prickle of apprehension that I couldn't quite shake off. Something about this place felt wrong, unnatural, oppressive. Then we rounded a bend in the path and I stopped dead in my tracks. The others bumped into me, stumbling to a halt behind me, their faces questioning. "What is it, Ben?" Liam asked, his voice sharp with impatience. "Another amazing shortcut that's actually just a dead end." I didn't answer him. I couldn't take my eyes off what was in front of us. In a small clearing just off the path, bathed in a patch of eerie, filtered sunlight that seemed to pierce the gloom, was a shrine. It was a crude structure, built of rough, unhewn stones, stacked haphazardly on top of each other, forming a low, circular wall. In the center of the stone circle was a pile of bones. Animal bones, mostly, I thought, though some of them were oddly shaped, too long, too thin, not quite like anything I recognized. Scattered among the bones were other strange objects, feathers, bits of fur, dried flowers, and symbols. Strange symbols were painted on the stones of the shrine in a dark, reddish-brown substance that looked like dried blood. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. A jumble of lines and curves and angles, vaguely geometric, vaguely organic, unsettlingly alien. They seemed to writhe and shift in my vision, like they were trying to communicate something. Something dark and incomprehensible. A wave of nausea washed over me, a primal revulsion that went beyond mere disgust. This wasn't just some forgotten hiker's memorial, or some quirky trail marker. This was something else. Something old, something dark, something wrong. What the hell is that? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. She took a step back, instinctively recoiling from the shrine. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disgust. Oh my God, are those bones? Animal bones. She looked like she was about to be sick. Liam stared at the shrine, his face pale, his usual skepticism replaced by a look of genuine apprehension. This is not good, he said slowly, his voice low and grave. This is really not good. For once, Liam and I were in complete agreement. This was bad. Very bad. My shortcut senses were screaming at me now, not with anticipation, but with alarm, with a desperate, urgent warning to turn back, to get away, to escape. Common sense, every instinct for self-preservation, was screaming at me to turn around, to get back to the main trail, to pretend we had never seen this place, to erase it from our memories. But curiosity, that insidious, irresistible human trait, that same reckless curiosity that had led me to suggest this shortcut in the first place, was still whispering in my ear, urging me closer, tempting me to investigate, to understand. Maybe it's just some kind of old hunting thin, I said weakly, my voice unconvincing even to myself. You know, like a hunter's shrine or something. People used to do that kind of stuff in the old days, right? Another flimsy attempt to rationalize the irrational, to explain away the inexplicable. Liam shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the shrine, his face grim. No. Ben, he said, his voice quiet but firm. That's not hunting, that's something else. Something older, something darker. He took another step back, put in more distance between himself and the shrine. We need to go, Ben. Now, this place, it feels wrong, really wrong. Sarah and Chloe nodded eagerly, their faces pale, their eyes darting nervously around the clearing, as if expecting some to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Even I, the ever-optimistic shortcut seeker, felt a cold dread creeping into my heart, a certainty that we had stumbled into something we didn't understand, something we shouldn't have disturbed. But still, that nagging curiosity, that reckless urge to explore, to understand, to take the shortcut, even when every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, held me rooted to the spot, my feet refusing to move. My eyes fixed on the unsettling shrine, on the strange symbols, on the pile of bones in the center of the stone circle. Just a quick look. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, drawn forward by an invisible force, against my better judgment, against all reason, against the desperate warning screaming in my head. Just to see what those symbols are. Maybe they're just some kind of Native American markings or something. Local history, you know. It could be interesting. Famous last words, echoing in the oppressive silence of the woods. Just a quick look, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, drawn forward by an invisible force, against my better judgment, against all reason, against the desperate warning screaming in my head. Just to see what those symbols are. Maybe they're just some kind of Native American markings, or something. Local history, you know. It could be interesting. Famous last words echoing in the oppressive silence of the woods. Ignoring the palpable fear radiating from Liam, Sarah, and Chloe, I took a tentative step towards the shrine. The clearing felt colder than the surrounding woods, a pocket of unnatural chill in the late summer air. The filtered sunlight, which had seemed almost welcoming moments before, now felt sickly and weak, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted around the stone circle. As I got closer, the details of the shrine became clearer, more disturbing. The stones were rough and jagged, many of them stained with dark patches that looked unnervingly like dried blood. The symbols painted on them were even more unsettling up close, a chaotic jumble of lines and curves that seemed to writhe and twist before my eyes. They weren't like any Native American markings I'd ever seen in books or museums. These were alien, primal, something ancient and deeply unsettling. The pile of bones in the center of the circle was even more gruesome than I'd initially thought. Mixed in with what were clearly animal bones, deer ribs, bird skulls. Rodent skeletons were other fragments that were less identifiable. Smaller bones, too delicate to be deer, too human-like in their shape, scattered amongst the animal remains. A cold dread washed over me, a sickening certainty that this wasn't just an animal shrine or some forgotten hunter's marker. This was something else entirely, something far more sinister. "Ben, don't," Liam said urgently, his voice sharp with fear. "Bear. Get away from there. Now. We need to leave. This place is bad news, man. Really bad news." He grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who was usually so reserved. Sarah and Chloe were backing away, their faces white, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies trembling. They clearly wanted nothing to do with the shrine, with this place, with my reckless curiosity. But something held me rooted to the spot. A morbid fascination, a terrible compulsion to understand, to see, to know. The shortcut had led us here to this unsettling place, and I couldn't just turn away, not without looking closer. Stupid, reckless, fatal curiosity. That's always been my downfall. Just a second. I mumbled, shaking off Lime's hand, taking another step closer to the shrine, my eyes fixed on the strange symbols, on the unsettling pile of bones. I just want to see those symbols. Maybe I can sketch them down or something. Maybe we can look them up later. Figure out what this place is. Another pathetic attempt to rationalize my reckless curiosity, to justify my insane desire to linger in this place of dread. As I reached the edge of the stone circle, I bent down, pulling out my phone, intending to take a picture of the symbols, to document what we had found, to somehow make sense of this unsettling discovery. But as I lowered my phone, the screen flickered, went black, and died. Just like that. No warning, no low battery indicator, just dead. What the? I muttered, tapping the power button, shaking the phone, trying to revive it, but it was no use. Completely unresponsive, dead as a doornail, and it had been fully charged this morning. My phone's dead too. Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, holding up her own phone, the screen equally black and lifeless. Chloe and Liam checked theirs as well, their faces confirming the same chilling reality. All our phones, all at once, dead. In this place, near this shrine. Coincidence? I highly doubted it. A cold wind suddenly swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves, sending a shiver down my spine. The filtered sunlight seemed to dim even further, the shadows deepening, twisting, becoming more menacing. The silence intensified, pressing in on us, suffocating, broken only by the rustling leaves and a new sound. A faint clicking sound, like dry bones rattling together. Coming from the shrine, from the pile of bones in the center of the stone circle. I froze, my blood running cold, my eyes fixed on the shrine, on the pile of bones. The clicking sound grew louder, more insistent, more rhythmic, like bones being shaken in macabre rattle. And then the bones started to move. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but then faster, more violently, the bones in the pile shifting, sliding, rattling against each other, as if something was moving beneath them, stirring them, bringing them to life. The pile of bones began to rise, to grow, to coalesce, the individual fragments clicking and grinding together, forming a shape, a form, something skeletal. A spine emerged, then ribs, then limbs, long, spindly limbs made of bone, clicking and rattling as they assembled themselves. A skull, or something vaguely skull-shaped, formed at the top, eyeless socket staring out from the bone white void. A skeleton. A crude, rattling, bone white skeleton. Assembled from the fragments in the shrine, rising from the pile of bones, animated by something. Something dark, something ancient, something of this place. It stood there, swaying slightly, its bone limbs clicking and grinding, its eyeless skull turning slowly, as if scanning the clearing, searching for something. And then it turned towards us, towards me. Its eyeless socket seemed to fix on me, to see me, to know me, even without eyes. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. A primal fear that went beyond anything I had ever experienced before. This wasn't just unsettling or creepy or wrong. This was evil. Tangible, palpable evil. Emanating from the bone-white figure, from the shrine, from this entire place. "Run!" Liam screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Ben, run! Get out of here!" Now, He didn't have to tell me twice. This time, even my reckless curiosity couldn't overcome the sheer, overwhelming terror. This time, even I knew instinctively that we had gone too far, taken the shortcut to somewhere we could never, ever come back from. We turned and fled, crashing blindly back down the path, away from the shrine, away from the bone-white figure, away from the clearing, away from the oppressive silence, the clicking bones, the ancient evil that had awakened in the heart of the woods. We ran and ran, stumbling, falling, scrambling back to our feet, not stopping, not looking back, just running, driven by pure, primal terror, fueled by the certainty that something was pursuing us. Something skeletal, something bone-white, something clicking and rattling through the trees behind us. We burst back onto the main trail, gasping for breath, our lungs burning, our legs aching, our hearts hammering against our ribs, the sounds of other hikers, the familiar trail markers, the blessed sunlight, a welcome, almost unbelievable relief. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot, collapsing against our car, panting, shaking, our faces pale, our eyes wide with lingering terror. We didn't speak for a long time. Just stood there, catching our breath, trying to process what we had seen, what we had experienced, the horror we had barely escaped. We never spoke of it again, not really. We tried to rationalize it, to explain it away, to dismiss it as some kind of hallucination, mass hysteria, a trick of the light, the fog, the oppressive atmosphere of the woods. But deep down, we all knew the truth. We had taken the shortcut, and we had paid the price. We had stumbled into something ancient and evil, something that dwelled in the heart of Rattlesnake Ridge, something that had been awakened by our reckless curiosity, by my stupid, insatiable need to take the shortcut, to find the angle, to explore the unknown. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is rustling the leaves outside my window, I still hear it, faintly, distantly, but undeniably the clicking of bones. And I know with a chilling certainty that the shortcut is still out there, waiting, listening, and that the price of curiosity is sometimes more than you can ever afford to pay. Story 4, my name is Sarah, and I have a confession. I'm a sucker for sunsets. There's something about that golden hour, the way the light softens and everything is bathed in warm hues, that just gets to me. It's romantic, peaceful, and undeniably beautiful. So, when the idea popped into my head to hike up to Eagle Peak late in the afternoon, specifically to watch the sunset from the summit, it seemed like the perfect plan. Eagle Peak isn't a particularly challenging hike, more of a moderate climb, but it boasts panoramic views, especially to the west, making it an ideal spot to watch the sun go down. I'd hiked it a few times before, always during the day, and always enjoyed it. But the thought of experiencing it at sunset, with the sky ablaze with color, was irresistible. My boyfriend Chris wasn't quite as enthusiastic about the idea. Chris is more of a practical type. He likes hiking, sure, but he's not driven by romantic notions or artistic impulses. He's more concerned with things like trail conditions, elevation gain, and, common sense. Sunset hike, he'd said, when I proposed the idea over dinner. He'd raised an eyebrow, a skeptical look on his face. You mean, like hiking in the dark? Coming down in the dark? Well, yeah, sort of. I'd admit it a little defensively. But it'll be worth it, Chris, trust me. Imagine the view. The sky all orange and pink. The valley spread out below us, it'll be amazing. And we'll bring headlamps, of course. We'll be prepared. Chris still looked unconvinced. I don't know, Sarah, he'd said, frowning slightly. Hiking at dusk, it just seems a little risky. What if we get lost? What if something happens? It'll be dark, and the trail isn't exactly easy in broad daylight. We won't get lost, I'd said, waving away his concerns. I know the trail pretty well, and we'll have headlamps and my phone GPS, and we'll stick together. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. I realize now the kind of naive optimism that horror movies are built upon. Chris had sighed, that familiar sound of resignation that meant he was giving in, but still wasn't entirely happy about it. Okay, fine, he'd said. But we leave early enough to get to the summit with plenty of daylight left, and we start heading down before it gets completely dark. Deal. Deal, I'd said, grinning, already picturing that perfect sunset view, pushing aside any lingering doubts or practical concerns. Romance and sunsets trump common sense, at least in my sunset-addicted brain. So, we set off for Eagle Peak late on a Saturday afternoon. We started hiking around 4 p.m., which in late summer should have given us plenty of time to reach the summit, enjoy the sunset, and still get down with some daylight to spare. The initial part of the hike was pleasant, the trail winding through sun-dappled woods, the air warm and still, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and insects. As we climbed higher, the trees began to thin out, replaced by more exposed, rocky terrain. The views started to open up, glimpses of the valley below appearing through gaps in the trees, teasing us with the promise of the panoramic vista that awaited us at the summit. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, the light softening, taking on that warm, golden hue I loved so much. Everything was bathed in that magical pre-sunset glow, and for a while, even Chris seemed to relax and enjoy the beauty of the moment. We reached the summit around 6 p.m., with still plenty of daylight left, just as the sun was starting to dip towards the horizon. And the view, it was breathtaking. The valley stretched out below us, a patchwork of fields and forests, bathed in the warm, golden light of the setting sun. The sky was ablaze with color, streaks of orange, pink, and gold painting the clouds, a masterpiece of natural beauty unfolding before our eyes. Whoa! Chris breathed, finally his usual skepticism momentarily forgotten, his eyes wide with awe. You were right, Sarah. This is incredible. I told you, I said, grinning, feeling a smug sense of satisfaction. Worth the hike, right? We spent a good hour on the summit, just soaking it all in, watching as the sun slowly sank below the horizon, the colors in the sky shifting and changing, deepening, becoming more vibrant, then gradually fading into softer pastel hues. It was everything I had hoped for and more. Romantic, peaceful, utterly beautiful. But as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, a noticeable shift occurred. The temperature plummeted, dropping sharply as the sun's warmth vanished. The golden light faded, replaced by a rapidly deepening twilight. The forest, which had been alive with sound just moments before, grew eerily silent. The birds stopped singing, the insects fell quiet, and a heavy, oppressive silence descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. Dusk in the mountains, I was starting to realize, was not romantic. It wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. The beauty of the sunset had masked a darker, more primal reality, a shift in the natural world, a change in the rules of the wilderness. Daylight was safety, warmth, visibility. Dusk was something else entirely. Okay, Chris said, his voice suddenly brisk, breaking the spell of the sunset. Okay, sunset's over. It's getting late. He was right. The last vestiges of daylight were fading rapidly, and the forest was darkening around us with alarming speed. We turned to start heading back down the trail, pulling out our headlamps, switching them on, their beams cutting through the rapidly deepening gloom. The trail, which had been so clear and easy to follow in the daylight, now looked different, unfamiliar, shadowed and indistinct in the narrow beams of our headlamps. Stick close, Chris said, his voice low and serious, his usual relaxed demeanor replaced by focused intensity. And watch your footing. It's going to be slippery in the dark. We started down the trail, the descent steeper and rockier than I remembered from the way up. The headlamps cast long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted around us, playing tricks on our eyes, making familiar shapes seem strange and menacing. The silence of the forest was now heavy, oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the rocky trail and the sound of our own breathing. And then we heard it, a sound, faint and distant at first, but growing steadily closer, a rustling in the underbrush just off the trail, something moving through the leaves, something unseen. We heard it. A sound faint and distant at first, but growing steadily closer, a rustling in the underbrush, just off the trail, something moving through the leaves, something unseen. The rustling was subtle at first, easily dismissed as the wind, or a small animal foraging in the undergrowth. But there was no wind. The air was still heavy, and the rustling was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be just a random animal. It was like something was moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us, just out of sight, hidden in the deepening shadows. I stopped, holding up a hand to Chris, my heart starting to pound in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the crunch of our boots on the rocky trail. Chris stopped too, his headlamp beam swiveling nervously, scanning the dark woods on either side of the path. He listened intently for a moment, his brow furrowed, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper himself. "Yeah, I hear it. What is it?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "Maybe a deer. Or a raccoon." Another flimsy attempt at rationalization, another desperate grasp at normalcy in a situation that was rapidly becoming anything but normal. Deer and raccoons didn't move like that. Not with that deliberate, rhythmic rustling, not keeping pace with hikers in the gathering darkness. The rustling continued, closer now, more distinct, no longer easily dismissed. It was definitely something moving through the undergrowth, something larger than a raccoon, too heavy to be a bird, too purposeful to be just a random animal. It sounded like something was following us. Let's pick up the pace," Chris said, his voice tight, urging me forward with a gentle push on my arm. "Probably just some wildlife, curious about our headlamps. If we move faster, it'll probably leave us alone." We started walking faster, our pace quickening, almost breaking into a jog, our headlamp beams bouncing erratically on the trail ahead. The rustling in the underbrush also quickened, keeping pace with our increased speed, still just off the trail, still unseen, but undeniably there, following us, listening to us, waiting. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming taller, darker, their branches intertwining overhead, blotting out the last vestiges of the twilight sky. The shadows deepened, becoming absolute, impenetrable, the beams of our headlamps feeling increasingly weak, inadequate against the encroaching darkness. The silence intensified, broken only by our ragged breathing, the crunch of our boots, the rustling in the underbrush, and a new sound. A low, guttural moan echoing through the trees, distant at first, but growing steadily louder, closer, more resonant, a sound that vibrated deep in my chest, a sound that sent a shiver of primal fear down my spine. What was that? Emily gasped, stopping dead again, her eyes wide with terror, her hand clutching at my arm, her grip like ice. "Chris, did you hear that? What is that sound?" Chris stopped too, his face pale, his headlamp beam swiveling wildly, searching the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the moan. "I don't know," he stammered, his voice trembling now, his carefully constructed face, out of practicality, finally starting to crumble. Maybe it's just the wind in the trees." Another weak, desperate attempt at rationalization, another futile effort to explain away the inexplicable horror that was unfolding around us. But there was no wind. The air was still, suffocatingly still, and the moan was too deep, too guttural, too alive to be the wind. It was a sound of pain, of suffering, of something ancient and tormented, echoing through the darkness, resonating with a chilling, otherworldly quality. The moan came again, louder this time, closer, more distinct, no longer just a distant echo, but a palpable presence. A sound that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, from the earth beneath our feet, from the darkness that surrounded us. It was a sound that spoke of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been here in these woods for a long, long time, something that was aware of us, aware of our presence, aware of our fear. "We need to go," I said urgently, my voice trembling, my heart pounding against my ribs, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Chris, we have to run. Now, whatever that is, whatever is making those sounds, we don't want to find out." Chris nodded, his face grim, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "Run," he breathed, grabbing my hand, pulling me forward, breaking into a full-out sprint down the rocky trail, our headlamp beams bouncing wildly, casting grotesque, distorted shadows that danced and flickered around us. We ran blindly through the darkness, our lungs burning, our legs aching, our breath coming in ragged gasps, the drumming of our hearts pounding in our ears, the rustling in the underbrush keeping pace with us, the moaning echoing through the trees, and now a new sound, joining the chorus of horrors in the darkening woods. Heavy breathing. Just behind us, just off the trail, something was breathing heavily, raggedly, a deep, labored breathing that was too close, too loud, too inhuman to be just an animal. It was the breathing of something large, something powerful, something pursuing us. The heavy breathing grew closer, faster, more insistent, the rustling in the underbrush intensifying, the moaning echoing through the trees, the darkness pressing in on us, the headlamp beams feeling weaker, more futile against the encroaching night. We were running blindly, desperately, through a nightmare landscape pursued by unseen horrors, surrounded by sounds of dread, trapped in a darkness that seemed to be alive, sentient, malevolent. And then our headlamps died. Both of them, at the same instant, flickering once, twice, and then plunging us into absolute, utter, impenetrable darkness, just like that. No warning, no fading light, just nothing. Darkness absolute. Darkness complete, darkness total, swallowing us whole, leaving us blind, helpless, exposed in the heart of the night-shrouded woods, with only the sounds of pursuit to guide us, to terrify us, to drive us onward into the black abyss. And then our headlamps died. Both of them at the same instant, flickering once, twice, and then plunging us into absolute, utter, impenetrable darkness. Just like that. No warning, no fading light, just nothing. Darkness absolute, darkness complete, darkness total, swallowing us whole, leaving us blind, helpless. Exposed in the heart of the night, shrouded woods, with only the sounds of pursuit to guide us, to terrify us, to drive us onward into the black abyss. The darkness was consuming. Not just the absence of light, but a tangible presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on us from all sides, robbing us of sight, of depth perception, of any sense of our surroundings. It was a darkness that felt alive, sentient, malevolent, a darkness that seemed to listen, to watch, to wait. We stumbled to a halt, our momentum carrying us forward for a few more steps before we tripped and almost fell, our hands outstretched, groping blindly in the void, trying to find something, anything to orient ourselves, to anchor ourselves in the overwhelming blackness. "Chris," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible in the suffocating darkness. "Chris, are you there? Can you see anything?" "Sarah." His voice came back really hushed, equally panicked, just inches away from me, yet sounding distant, muffled by the oppressive darkness. "Yeah, I'm here." "No, I can't see a thing. It's like being blind." A blind. That's exactly what it felt like. We were plunged into a world without sight, reduced to our other senses. Senses that were now screaming with terror, overwhelmed by the sounds of pursuit, the rustling in the underbrush, the heavy breathing, the guttural moaning, all amplified by the absolute silence of the forest, the silence that swallowed all other sounds except for the sounds of our own fear. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice firmer now, adrenaline starting to override the initial paralysis of terror. "We can't stay here. Whatever is out there, it's still coming." "Book, which way?" Chris whispered back, his voice laced with despair. "I can't see the trail. I can't see anything. We're completely lost in the dark." "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't just stand here and wait for whatever it is to catch us. We have to keep moving. Downhill." We were heading downhill, right? If we keep going downhill, we should eventually hit the bottom of the mountain or something. Another desperate, flimsy plan born of pure panic, but it was all we had. We started moving again, slowly, cautiously, feeling our way through the darkness, our hands outstretched, groping for trees, for rocks, for anything that could guide us, that could prevent us from stumbling and falling in the unseen terrain. Every step was tentative, uncertain, fraught with the fear of tripping, of falling, of twisting an ankle, of being completely immobilized in this nightmarish darkness. The rustling in the underbrush continued, keeping pace with us, just off to the side, unseen but always present, a constant reminder that we were not alone, that we were being pursued, hunted. Listened to in the darkness. The heavy breathing was closer now, louder, more ragged, the guttural moaning echoing through the trees, surrounding us, enveloping us in a symphony of terror. And then the moaning changed. It wasn't just a sound of pain or suffering anymore. It became a voice. Not a human voice, not anything recognizable, but a voice nonetheless, deep, resonant, guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt deep in my bones, in my soul. The voice was speaking our names. Sarah, Chris, just like the whispers in the fog, but clearer now, louder, more distinct, no longer just whispers, but a deep, resonant voice echoing through the darkness, calling us, claiming us, welcoming us to the night. "Did you hear that?" Emily gasped, her voice choked with terror. It's calling our names. It knows our names, Ashley. How does it know our names?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how it knew our names. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that it was terrifying, impossibly terrifying, to hear that inhuman voice speaking our names in the absolute darkness, in the heart of the night-shrouded woods, surrounded by unseen horrors, pursued by something that breathed and moaned and listened in the dark. The voice continued to call our names, echoing through the trees, weaving through the rustling underbrush, blending with the heavy breathing, creating a cacophony of terror that was almost unbearable. And then the rustling stopped, abruptly, completely, just like the drumming had stopped before. The heavy breathing ceased as well. The guttural moaning faded into silence. Only the voice remained, echoing through the darkness, calling our names, Sarah, Chris, Sarah, Chris. The silence that followed the cessation of the other sounds was even more terrifying than the cacophony had been. A heavy, expectant silence, a silence that felt like waiting, like something was holding its breath, poised to strike, listening for our next move, waiting for us to make a mistake. And then the voice changed again. It was no longer just calling our names. It started speaking, still in that guttural, inhuman language, but now forming words, phrases, sentences, too deep, too resonant to be understood, but somehow comprehensible in a primal, instinctual way. I didn't understand the words, not consciously, but I understood their meaning, their intent. They were speaking of the night, of the darkness, of the woods, of the creatures that dwelled in the darkness, that hunted in the night, that listened in the silence. They were speaking of us. They were saying that the night was theirs, that the darkness belonged to them, that the woods were their domain, and that we were intruders, trespassers, lost souls who had strayed into their realm, who had violated the ancient rules of the night, who had dared to hike at dusk, to linger in the twilight, to ignore the warnings of the fading light. And now the night was claiming us. The darkness was taking hold. The woods were listening. And the creatures of the night, they were coming for us. The voice grew louder, more insistent, more demanding, echoing through the darkness, pressing in on us, suffocating us, driving us to the edge of madness. And then the darkness itself seemed to shift, to change, to become more than just the absence of light, more than just the shadows of the trees. It became tangible, solid, real. The air grew colder, colder than any natural night chill, a bone deep, penetrating cold that seeped into our skin, our muscles, our very bones, freezing us from the inside out. The darkness seemed to thicken, to become almost viscous, like we were wading through treacle, our movements becoming slower, more labored, more difficult. In the darkness it started to move, not like fog, not like mist, but like a living thing. The darkness itself seemed to flow, to swirl, to coalesce, to reach out tendrils, to grasp at us, to envelop us, to pull us deeper into its suffocating embrace. It was like the night itself was alive, sentient, and hungry, and it was consuming us slowly, inexorably, swallowing us whole body and soul, claiming us for its own dark domain. We were trapped, utterly, irrevocably trapped, lost in the absolute darkness, pursued by unseen horrors, surrounded by sounds of dread, consumed by a sentient night that was alive, hungry, and closing in. And as the darkness enveloped me completely, as the cold seeped into my bones, as the inhuman voice echoed in my skull, calling my name, claiming my soul, I knew with a chilling certainty that this was the end. Dusk had fallen, night had risen, and we had ignored the signs for too long. Now the darkness had taken hold, and there was no escape. Story 5. My name is Chris, and I'm not usually one for backing down, especially not from a dare. It's a guy thing, I guess, a stupid testosterone-fueled impulse to prove you're not scared, even when you probably should be. And my friends, well, they know how to push those buttons. Liam, especially. He's the instigator, the one who always comes up with the crazy ideas, the dares that toe the line between thrilling and insane. Our group has been tight since middle school. Me, Liam, Mike, and Emily. Yeah, Emily, the token girl, but she's tougher than any of us, honestly. We've been through everything together, from awkward dances to first heartbreaks. And through it all, there's always been the dares. Stupid dares, mostly. Eating disgusting combinations of food, pulling pranks, minor acts of vandalism that we probably shouldn't have done but seemed hilarious at the time. Harmless stuff, usually. Until this one. It started, as most of our bad ideas do, at Liam's place late on a Friday night. We were sprawled out in his basement, fueled by pizza and cheap soda. killing time before heading out wherever the night took us. Mike was messing around with his phone, scrolling through some local history website, when he suddenly stopped, his eyes widening. "Dude, check this out," he said, holding up his phone, showing us the screen. "Remember the old Blackwood house? The one out on the edge of town?" We all nodded. Everyone in our town knew about the Blackwood house. It was a local legend, a dilapidated Victorian mansion on Blackwood Lane, shrouded in rumors and whispered stories of tragedy and hauntings. It had been abandoned for years, slowly decaying, becoming a local landmark of sorts, a spooky silhouette against the skyline on the outskirts of town. "Yeah, the haunted house," Emily said, rolling her eyes, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "What about it?" Emily is practical, grounded, not easily swayed by ghost stories or local folklore. "Apparently," Mike continued, reading from his phone, "it has a real history, like seriously messed up. The Blackwood family, who built it back in the 1800s, had a string of tragedies. Fires, accidents, suicides, the whole place is supposed to be cursed." Liam's eyes lit up, that familiar spark of mischief igniting in their depths. "Cursed, huh?" he said, a grin spreading across his face. "No, that's interesting. Liam loves anything spooky, anything mysterious, anything that smacks of the paranormal. He's the one who dragged us to every supposedly haunted spot in a 50-mile radius, armed with ghost detectors and EMF readers that never actually detected anything." "Yeah. Interesting, like stay the hell away from it interesting," Emily said, shaking her head. "It's just an old house, guys. Probably falling apart, full of asbestos and raccoons. There's nothing cursed about it." "But what if there is?" Liam persisted, his grin widening. "What if it is haunted? Wouldn't it be awesome to check it out? For research purposes." He wiggled his eyebrows, that classic Liam move that usually precedes some kind of ridiculous, ill-advised plan. "Research purposes," Mike scoffed. "Come on, Liam. You just want to see if you can find a ghost." Well, yeah, maybe," Liam admitted, shrugging. "But think about it, Gauss. The Blackwood Inn for years, supposedly cursed. It's like something straight out of a horror movie. Wouldn't it be epic to actually go inside, explore it, see if there's anything weird going on?" Mike started to look intrigued, his initial skepticism wavering. "I don't know, man," he said, scratching his chin. "It's probably trespassing, and it's probably dangerous. That place is probably falling apart." Details, Liam waved dismissively. "We're careful. We're not going to break anything. And who's going to know? It's abandoned. No one goes out there. Except for urban explorers and teenagers looking for a thrill," Emily pointed out dryly. "And probably the cops checking for trespassers." Okay. Maybe it's a little risky." Liam conceded, his enthusiasm undimmed. "But think of the story, guys. We explored the Blackwood house, the most haunted place in town. We'd be legends!" And I dare you. There it was. The dare. The challenge, the gauntlet thrown down. I knew it was coming. Liam always played that card when he really wanted us to do something stupid, and it usually worked. Mike hesitated, glancing at me, then at Emily. Emily just rolled her eyes again, but I could see a flicker of something in her expression. Curiosity, intrigue, maybe even a tiny bit of fear. I knew I should say no. It was a stupid idea. Risky, pointless, probably illegal. But Lime was right. The Blackwood house. It was legendary. And the thought of actually going inside, of exploring its dark, decaying rooms, of facing whatever might be lurking within it was undeniably tempting. Especially when Liam framed it as a dare. "What kind of dare?" I asked, playing it cool, trying not to sound too eager, even though a part of me was already hooked. Liam grinned, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "The full Blackwood challenge," he declared, his voice dramatic. "We go to the Blackwood house tonight, midnight. We go inside, explore the whole place, basement to attic, and we spend an hour inside, in the dark. No flashlights, no phones, just us, and whatever else might be in there. Midnight, an hour in the dark, in the Blackwood house, the haunted house, the cursed house, the house that everyone in town whispered about, but no one ever dared to go near. It was insane. Completely, utterly insane." And then I was already starting to say yes. "An hour," Emily said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Liam, are you serious? An hour in that place, in the dark. That's not a dare, that's just stupid." "Exactly. Liam said, his grin widening even further. It's epic stupid. That's what makes it awesome. Come on, guys. Don't be chickens. Are you in? Or are you going to let a little ghost story scare you? He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes challenging, taunting, daring us to back down. Mike was already nodding, his initial hesitation completely gone, replaced by a thrill-seeking grin that mirrored Liam's. I'm in, he said, his voice eager. Midnight at the Blackwood House. Let's do it. Emily sighed, rolling her eyes again, but there was a reluctant smile playing on her lips. Fine, she said, shaking her head, but with a hint of amusement in her voice. Fine, I'm in too. But if we get arrested or eaten by ghosts, I'm blaming you too. She pointed at Liam and Mike. All eyes turned to me. Liam, Mike, Emily, all waiting for my answer, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and challenge. The dare hung in the air, heavy, irresistible, terrifyingly tempting. Midnight at the Blackwood House. An hour in the dark, facing the unknown, the whispered legends, the possible horrors. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and not a fear tightening in my stomach. It was stupid. Insane. But I couldn't back down. Not from a dare. Not in front of my friends. Not when Liam was looking at me like that with that knowing, challenging grin. All right, I said, my voice sounding braver than I felt. All right. I'm in Midnight at the Blackwood House. Let's do this thing. Liam hoop punching the air, his face alight with triumph. Yes. Awesome. Midnight it is. Blackwood House, here we come. But even as I echoed his enthusiasm, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Midnight at the Blackwood House. It sounded exciting, adventurous, epic. But deep down, a small, nagging voice whispered a warning, a feeling of unease that went beyond mere apprehension. A feeling that we were making a mistake. A big mistake. A mistake that we might regret. A mistake that we might not be able to come back from. The hours between Liam's dare and midnight stretched out, filled with a nervous energy that none of us really acknowledged, but we all felt. We tried to act normal, hanging out at Liam's, playing video games, ordering more pizza. But the Blackwood House hung over us like a shadow, an unspoken presence in the room. Every so often, someone would glance at the clock, or nervously adjust their clothes, or make a forced joke about ghosts, and the tension would ratchet up another notch. As midnight approached, the bravado started to fade, replaced by a more subdued, apprehensive mood. Even Liam, the instigator, seemed a little quieter, a little less enthusiastic. Mike, usually the jokester, was uncharacteristically silent, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting something to jump out at him from the shadows of Liam's basement. Emily, ever practical, was the most outwardly composed, but I could see a tightness around her mouth, a flicker of worry in her eyes that betrayed her outward calm. I wasn't feeling so brave myself. The initial thrill of the dare, the stupid testosterone-fueled impulse to prove myself, had worn off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The Blackwood House, midnight, an hour in the dark. The reality of what we were about to do was starting to sink in, and it wasn't nearly as fun or exciting as it had seemed just a few hours earlier. Around 11:30 p.m., we finally piled into Liam's beat up Honda Civic, the silence in the car thick and heavy. The drive out to Blackwood Lane felt longer than it actually was, the familiar streets of our town gradually giving way to darker, more secluded roads, lined with older houses. Their windows dark and uninviting. The air outside seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere heavier, as we drove further away from the lights and sounds of civilization, towards the edge of town, towards the Blackwood House. Blackwood Lane itself was even creepier than I remembered. It was a narrow, unpaved road, lined with overgrown trees that formed a dark, arcing canopy overhead, blocking out the moonlight, casting the road in deep, impenetrable shadows. The air here was still silent, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It felt isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, a place where anything could happen, and no one would ever know. We parked Lamb's car at the end of Blackwood Lane, as far away from the Blackwood House as we could get while still being on the same road. The house itself was barely visible from the road, hidden behind a thick screen of overgrown trees and tangled bushes, a dark, looming shape against the slightly less dark sky. Getting out of the car felt like stepping into a different world. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind, a sound that seemed to whisper secrets, warnings, threats. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with an almost palpable sense of wrongness. A feeling of unease that settled deep in your bones, a primal instinct screaming at you to turn back, to run, to escape this place of darkness and dread. We stood there for a moment, huddled together by the car, our headlamps switched off, the darkness pressing in on us, the silence amplifying the pounding of our hearts. No one spoke. No one moved. We were all frozen, caught in the grip of a shared fear, collective apprehension that was almost overwhelming. Then, Liam cleared his throat, breaking the silence, his voice sounding strained, almost forced. "Okay," he said, his voice too loud in the stillness. "Okay, guys, midnight. Time to do this thing." He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his phone, checking the time. Midnight on the dot. Let's go. He started walking towards the overgrown path that led to the Blackwood house, his footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel road, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. Mike followed his movements, hesitant, his eyes darting nervously around. Emily and I brought up the rear, our steps slow, reluctant, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The path to the house was even more overgrown than it had looked from the road, barely discernible, swallowed by weeds and tangled vines. We had to push our way through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots, tripping over fallen branches, our progress slow and clumsy. The darkness seemed to thicken with every step, the trees looming closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, their leaves whispering secrets we didn't want to hear. And then we saw it. The Blackwood house. Looming out of the darkness, a massive, decaying silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, a gothic monstrosity of crumbling stone and rotting wood, its windows dark and empty, like vacant eyes staring out into the night. It was even more imposing, more menacing, more wrong than I had ever imagined. The local legends, the whispered stories, the rumors of hauntings suddenly, they didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Standing here in the darkness, facing this decaying mansion, it felt plausible. It felt like anything could be lurking within those dark walls. Anything could be watching us from those empty windows. We stopped at the edge of the property, a wrought iron gate, rusted and overgrown with vines, marking the boundary between the overgrown path and the even more overgrown grounds of the Blackwood house. The gate was hanging open, creaking ominously in the non-existent breeze, an invitation, or perhaps a warning to enter. Liam hesitated at the gate, his bravado seeming to falter for a moment, even for him. He glanced back at us, his eyes searching ours, a flicker of doubt, of apprehension crossing his face. But then he straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and pushed the gate open further, the rusted hinges groaning in protest, a sound that echoed eerily in the silence. "Well," he said, his voice strained, trying to recapture his earlier enthusiasm, but failing to quite pull it off. "Well, here we are. The Blackwood house. Ready to face the darkness, guys." He stepped through the gate into the grounds of the mansion, his headlamp beam cutting a narrow swath through the darkness. Mike followed, his movements quicker now, almost jerky, as if he just wanted to get it over with. Emily took a deep breath, then stepped through the gate as well, her face set, determined, but still pale. I hesitated for a moment longer, staring at the looming darkness of the Blackwood house, feeling a cold dread grip my heart, a certainty that we were crossing a line, entering a place from which we might not return unchanged. But then the stupid, prideful dare kicked in again. I couldn't back down now. Not after coming this far, not in front of my friends. Not when Liam was already inside, disappearing into the darkness of the Blackwood house. Taking a deep breath, trying to ignore the icy knot of fear in my stomach, I stepped through the gate, into the grounds of the Blackwood house, into the waiting darkness, into the unknown horrors that might be lurking within. The rusted gate creaked shut behind me, as if sealing us in, trapping us in the embrace of the Blackwood house, in the heart of its whispered legends, in the realm of its ancient dread. The rusted gate creaked shut behind me, as if sealing us in, trapping us in the embrace of the Blackwood house, in the heart of its whispered legends, in the realm of its ancient dread. The grounds were as overgrown and neglected as the lane leading to them, a tangled wilderness of weeds, bushes, and gnarled trees that clawed at us as we made our way towards the house. The Blackwood house loomed closer, growing larger, more imposing, its dark silhouette dominating the night sky, its empty windows like vacant eyes watching our every move. Liam led the way, his headlamp beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness, his footsteps echoing eerily on the overgrown path. Mike followed close behind, his movements jerky and nervous, his headlamp beam darting wildly around, as if expecting something to jump out at him from the shadows. Emily and I trailed behind, our steps slower, more hesitant, our senses straining, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Reaching the front of the house, we stood before the main entrance, a massive oak door, rotting and warped, its dark wood scarred and weathered by years of neglect. The door was slightly ajar, hanging open just a crack, like a gaping maw inviting us into its dark interior. Above the door, a single, arched window was visible, its glass long gone, leaving a gaping black hole that seemed to stare down at us with malevolent intent. The air around the house was even colder, heavier, more oppressive than in the lane. The silence here was absolute, like broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind and the frantic pounding of my own heart. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves was stronger here, mixed with a musty, acrid odor that smelled like rot, decay, death. Liam hesitated at the door, his bravado seeming to waver again, even for him. He glanced back at us, his eyes searching ours, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face. But then, he took a deep breath, reached out, and pushed the door open wider. The rusted hinges groaning loudly, a sound that echoed through the silent grounds, a sound that seemed to awaken something within the house, something dark and unseen. "Okay," Liam said, his voice strained barely above a whisper. "Okay, guys, here we go, into the Blackwood house. Remember, 1 hour, then we're out. Stick together. And try not to touch anything." He stepped through the doorway, disappearing into the blackness within. Mike followed quickly, almost stumbling in his haste to get inside. Emily took a deep breath, then stepped through the doorway as well, her face pale, her eyes wide, her expression a mixture of fear and grim determination. I lingered for a moment longer, staring into the absolute darkness of the Blackwood house, feeling a cold dread grip my heart, a certainty that we were making a terrible mistake, that we were crossing a threshold from which there was no return. But then the stupid, prideful dare, kicked in again. I couldn't back down now. Not after coming this far. Not in front of my friends. Not when they were already inside, disappearing into the darkness of the Blackwood house. Taking a deep breath, trying to ignore the icy knot of fear in my stomach, I stepped through the doorway into the Blackwood house, in the waiting darkness, into the unknown horrors that might be lurking within. The heavy oak door creaked shut behind me, as if slamming shut, sealing us in, trapping us in the darkness of the Blackwood house, in the heart of its whispered legends, in the realm of its ancient dread. The darkness inside was absolute, impenetrable, even thicker, more oppressive than outside. It was like stepping into a sensory deprivation chamber. All light, all sound, all sense of the outside world, instantly extinguished, leaving us alone in a void of pure, unadulterated blackness. The air inside was cold, damp, and heavy with the same musty, decaying odor that had permeated the grounds, but amplified here, intensified, almost overwhelming. We switched on our headlamps, their beams cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness, revealing a decaying entrance hall, its once grand features now crumbling and rotting. Dust motes danced in the beams of our lights. Thick cobwebs hung like ghostly shrouds from the ceiling. The walls were peeling and cracked. The floorboards creaked ominously under our feet. The air was thick with the silence, a silence that felt heavy, expectant, pregnant with unseen presences, unheard whispers, unknown horrors. "Okay," Liam said, his voice echoing eerily in the vast, empty hall. "Okay, guys, let's stick together. Mike, you take point. Emily, you bring up the rear. Sarah and I will stay in the middle. Headlamps on, but try to keep the beams low so we don't attract attention." His voice trailed off, the unspoken word hanging heavy in the air ghosts. We moved slowly, cautiously, deeper into the Blackwood house, our headlamp beams sweeping across the decaying grandeur of the mansion, revealing glimpses of long, forgotten rooms, shadowy hallways, crumbling staircases, all shrouded in darkness, dust, and decay. Each room was worse than the last, each hallway more oppressive, each creaking floorboard sending a jolt of fear through our hearts. The silence was broken only by our own nervous whispers, the crunch of our boots on the debris-strewn floor, and the constant, rhythmic creaking of the house itself, settling, groaning, whispering its secrets in the darkness. We explored the ground floor, room after room, each one filled with the same oppressive darkness, the same musty odor, the same sense of decay and dread. We found a decaying library, its bookshelves empty, its once elegant furniture rotting and collapsing. We found a formal dining room, its long table covered in dust, its chairs overturned, its atmosphere heavy with a sense of long abandoned meals, of forgotten gatherings of unspoken tragedies. We found a parlor, its once ornate wallpaper peeling from the walls, its fireplace cold and empty, its air thick with a sense of lingering sorrow, of unspoken grief. And then we found the stairs, a grand curving staircase leading upwards into the darkness of the upper floors, its wooden steps creaking ominously under our weight, its shadows deepening, twisting, becoming more menacing as we ascended. The air on the stairs was colder, heavier, more oppressive than anywhere else in the house. The silence here was absolute, tomb-like, broken only by the creaking of the stairs and the frantic pounding of our hearts. As we climbed higher, the feeling of unease intensified, the sense of being watched, of being followed, of being surrounded by unseen presences, growing stronger, more palpable. The whispers started again, faint and distant at first, but growing steadily louder, closer, more insistent as we ascended the creaking stairs, weaving through the oppressive silence, echoing in the darkness of the Blackwood house. The whispers were calling our names. Chris, Leon, Mike, Emilia. Faintly at first, then louder, closer, until it seemed like the house itself was speaking our names, the walls were whispering our names. The darkness was calling us, claiming us, welcoming us deeper into its embrace. Reaching the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long, shadowy hallway lined with closed doors, each one a dark, silent portal leading into another unknown room, another potential horror, another step deeper into the heart of the Blackwood house. The whispers were loudest here, swirling around us, pressing in on us, the voices closer, clearer, more insistent, no longer just whispers, but almost intelligible words, forming phrases, sentences, too faint to understand, but too close to ignore, weaving through the darkness, echoing in our minds, chilling us to the bone. And then, from behind one of the closed doors, at the end of the hallway, we heard it. A sound faint and distant at first, but growing steadily louder, closer, more distinct, a sound that made our blood run cold, a sound that confirmed our deepest fears, a sound that told us, with chilling certainty, that we were not alone in the Blackwood house, that something else was here, something dark, something ancient, something waiting for us in the darkness. A child's ladder, faint, high-pitched, echoing through the darkness, a sound of innocent joy, twisted, corrupted, made terrifying by the oppressive silence, by the decaying grandeur of the Blackwood house, by the chilling whispers that swirled around us, by the absolute certainty that whatever was laughing, whatever was waiting behind that closed door, was not human, was not innocent, was not friendly. Estaroi 6, my name is Daniel, and I'm what you might call meticulous. Some people would say obsessive, but I prefer meticulous. Everything in my life has its place, its order, its designated spot. Keys go on the hook by the door, wallet in my left back pocket, phone on the charger by my bedside table. You get the picture. Chaos makes me uneasy. Order, routine. That's my comfort zone. So, when I realized something was missing, it wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a disruption, a tear in the fabric of my carefully constructed reality. It started subtly, a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, a sense that something was off. It took me a while to pinpoint it, to identify the source of my unease. But then, one morning, as I was getting ready to leave for work, it hit me. The key. My spare key was gone. Now, this wasn't just any spare key. It was a specific key, a small, antique-looking brass key with a simple, almost ornate design on the head. I didn't even know what it unlocked. I'd found it years ago, tucked away in a dusty old box of my grandfather's belongings after he passed away. It wasn't a house key or a car key or anything obviously identifiable. It was just a key, a mystery key. For some reason, I'd kept it. It was kind of cool looking in a vintage, mysterious way. I tossed it into a small wooden dish on my dresser, along with spare change, cufflinks, and other random trinkets. It had been there for years, unnoticed, unneeded, just there, until it wasn't. I noticed it was missing about a week ago. At first, I just assumed I'd moved it, misplaced it, maybe even used it for something and forgotten. I searched the usual places: pockets, drawers, under the sofa cushions, even inside my toolbox, just in case. Logic sometimes takes a backseat to that nagging feeling of something's wrong. But the key was nowhere to be found. I emptied the wooden dish on my dresser, carefully sorting through the spare change, the cufflinks, the random buttons and paper clips that had accumulated there over time. No key. I checked the dish itself, turning it upside down, shaking it, just in case it had somehow gotten stuck inside. Nothing. The key was gone, vanished. Now, rationally, I know it's just a key. A spare key to something I don't even know. It's not like it's the key to my apartment, or my car, or anything actually important. I have other spare keys for those things, neatly labeled and organized in my key drawer in the kitchen. This was just a random antique key. Insignificant, really. So why was I so bothered by its disappearance? That's the thing, though. It wasn't just about the key itself. It was about the loss, the disruption of order, the feeling that something was out of place, that something had been taken. It violated my sense of control, my meticulously maintained routine. And that, I realized, was what was truly unsettling me. Over the next few days, the unease grew. It started subtly, just a slight feeling of wrongness. Whenever I looked at the empty space in the wooden dish where the key used to be, then it started to creep into other areas of my life. I started feeling watched, like there was something just outside my peripheral vision, something I couldn't quite see, but could definitely sense. It was irrational, I know. Paranoia, probably. Stress from work, maybe. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times before leaving the apartment, and again when I got home. I started glancing over my shoulder when I walked down the street, feeling like someone was following me, even though when I turned around, there was never anyone there. I even started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old apartment building, every rustle of leaves outside my window, every distant siren in the city, my mind racing, my heart pounding, convinced that something was wrong. Someone was in my apartment. Something was watching me. And then the dreams started. They were vague at first, just unsettling images, fleeting glimpses of shadows in dark hallways, whispers in empty rooms, a sense of being lost, of being trapped, of being searched for. But they grew more vivid, more disturbing, more focused with each passing night. In the dreams, I was always in my apartment, but it wasn't quite my apartment. It was darker, colder, more empty. The furniture was the same, but somehow different, older, more worn, covered in dust and shadows. The air was heavy, still, and filled with that same musty, decaying odor that I had started to associate with the missing key. And in the dreams, I was always searching for something, wandering through the darkened rooms, opening drawers, looking under furniture, my heart pounding with a sense of urgency, a desperate need to find something. I didn't know what I was looking for, not consciously, but I knew it was important, vitally important, that my very existence depended on finding it. And then, in the last dream, the one I had last night, I saw it. The key, my missing key. It wasn't in my apartment, not in the dream apartment. It was somewhere else. Somewhere dark, somewhere cold, somewhere other. In the dream, I was standing in a vast, echoing space, a cavernous room filled with shadows and whispers. The air was freezing, and the musty odor was overpowering, almost suffocating. In the center of the room, on a cold stone pedestal, bathed in a single weak beam of moonlight filtering down from somewhere high above, was the key, my key, the missing brass key. It was glowing faintly in the darkness, a soft, ethereal light emanating from its simple, ornate head, beckoning me forward, drawing me towards it, promising something. Something I desperately needed, something I had lost, something that was now waiting for me in the darkness. I woke up with a jolt, heart pounding, breath coming in ragged gasps, drenched in a cold sweat. The image of the key, glowing in the darkness, burned into my mind. The feeling of unease was no longer just a nagging sense, but a full-blown panic, cold, icy dread that gripped my soul. It wasn't just a missing key anymore. It was something else, something more, something lost. And I had a terrifying feeling that whatever I had lost, whatever that key unlocked, was looking for me too. The dream from last night, it shook me. More than just a nightmare, it felt like a message. A glimpse into something real, something beyond the waking world. Something connected to the missing key. The image of the key, glowing in that vast, dark space, haunted me throughout the day. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, intensified, morphing from a vague unease into a constant knowing anxiety. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away as stress, as an overactive imagination fueled by too much coffee and not enough sleep. I told myself it was just a dream, just a key, just my meticulous nature getting the better of me. But the feeling persisted, clinging to me like a shadow, growing stronger with each passing hour. Work was a blur. I went through the motions, performed my tasks, interacted with colleagues, but my mind was elsewhere, trapped in that dark, echoing space from the dream, fixated on the glowing key, wrestling with the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. I found myself constantly checking my pockets, my desk drawers, my briefcase, as if the key might magically reappear if I just looked hard enough. Of course, it never did. Lunch was a non-event. I sat in the break room, picking at a sandwich, barely tasting it, my mind still racing, my senses on high alert. I kept glancing around the room, feeling like someone was watching me, even though the break room was mostly empty. Just a few other colleagues quietly eating their lunches, oblivious to my inner turmoil. In the afternoon, the feeling intensified even further. The paranoia morphed into a sense of dread, a cold, icy fear that settled deep in my stomach, making me nauseous and lightheaded. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows, movements in my peripheral vision, glimpses of something dark just at the edge of my perception. I knew it was irrational. I knew it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by stress and lack of sleep. But the feeling was so real, so visceral, so persistent that I couldn't shake it off. It was like something was actively trying to get my attention, to break through the barrier of my rational mind, to force me to acknowledge its presence. By the time I left work, I was a nervous wreck. The walk home felt different, more menacing than usual. The familiar streets, the usual evening bustle, the comforting sounds of the city, they all seemed muted, distorted, somehow wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, the streetlights dimmer. The faces of passers-by indistinct, almost unreal. I hurried home, my pace quickening, almost breaking into a jog, my heart pounding with a sense of urgency, a desperate need to get back to the supposed safety of my apartment. But even as I unlocked my door and stepped inside, the feeling of unease didn't dissipate. It intensified. It was like I'd brought the darkness, the paranoia, the dread home with me. My apartment felt different too. Colder, emptier, more silent than usual. The familiar comfort in my meticulously ordered space was gone, replaced by a sense of a violation, of intrusion, of something being out of place. I went through my usual routine, checked the locks, turned on the lights, put my keys on the hook by the door, but it felt hollow, meaningless, like going through the motions of normalcy in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into corners, checking behind furniture, my eyes darting nervously around the apartment, searching for what? I didn't know. Something, anything. Some sign, some clue, some explanation for the growing dread that was consuming me. I went to the dresser, to the wooden dish, to the empty space where the key used to be. I stared at the dish for a long time, my mind blank, my senses straining, trying to feel something, to sense something, to get some kind of insight into the mystery of the missing key. And then I saw it, or rather, I felt it. A subtle shift in the air, a faint coolness, a momentary flicker of shadow in the corner of my eye, and a whisper. Faint, sibilant, barely audible, but undeniably there. A whisper that seemed to come from the wooden dish itself, from the empty space where the key had been. The whisper was just a sound, a sibilant susurrus, like dry leaves rustling in a non-existent breeze, but somehow I understood it. Not in words, not consciously, but instinctively, viscerally, deep in my soul. It was the key. The key was calling to me. The key was waiting. A sudden, overwhelming urge washed over me, a compulsion to find the key, to retrieve it, to reclaim what I had lost. The dream, the vast, dark space, the glowing key on the stone pedestal, it all clicked into place. That was where the key was. That was where I needed to go. But where was that place? Where was that dark, echoing space? It was just a dream, right? Just a figment of my imagination. Or was it? I stared at the wooden dissing, my mind racing, my heart pounding, my senses on high alert. And then, my eyes fell on the dresser itself. An old antique dresser inherited from my grandfather, along with the dusty box that had contained the key. A solid, heavy piece of furniture, with multiple drawers, each one filled with neatly folded clothes, organized, categorized, meticulously ordered, just like everything else in my life. And then I remembered something. Something I had almost forgotten. A detail about the dresser, a detail I had noticed years ago, but had dismissed as insignificant as just a quirk of old furniture. A drawer. A small, narrow drawer at the very bottom of the dresser, almost hidden, almost invisible, a drawer I had never been able to open. A locked drawer, a drawer without a key. The key. My missing key. The antique brass key. The key I couldn't place. The key I had found in my grandfather's box. The key that was no gone. Could it be? Could it be that the key unlocked the drawer? The drawer in my dresser. The drawer I had never been able to open. A jolt of electricity ran through me, a sudden surge of adrenaline, a terrifying, exhilarating realization. The dream. The whisper. The missing key. The locked drawer. It all connected into one thing. The key wasn't just a random trinket. It was a key to something. Something hidden. Something locked away. Something waiting. And the drawer in my dresser, could it be? Could it be that the drawer was the place for my dream? The dark, echoing space. The place where the key was waiting. The place I was being drawn to. A cold dread washed over me, mixed with a terrifying, irresistible curiosity. What was in that drawer? What secrets did it hold? What horrors might it unleash if I opened it? And why was I suddenly so compelled to open it now, after years of ignoring its locked, mysterious presence? The whisper came again, fainter this time, but still undeniably there, calling to me, beckoning me, drawing me towards the dresser, towards the locked drawer, towards the unknown horrors that might lie within. Key, the whisper seemed to say. Drawer open. Key drawer open. The whisper, faint as it was, settled the matter. Fear warred with a morbid curiosity, but the compulsion was stronger. I had to know, I had to open that drawer. I moved towards the dresser, my legs feeling heavy, leaden, as if walking through thick water. The antique wood seemed to loom larger as I approached, the shadows around it deepening, the musty odor intensifying, filling the air with the scent of decay and forgotten secrets. I stood before the dresser, staring at the locked drawer at the bottom. It was small, almost hidden, the wood around it darker, more weathered than the rest of the dresser, as if it had been deliberately concealed, intentionally forgotten. The lock itself was simple, a small brass keyhole, tarnished and green with age, a silent invitation, or perhaps a final warning. My hand trembled as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wood of the drawer front. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent, resonating in my mind, in my very bones. Key open now. The urgency in the whisper was undeniable, a demand, a terrifyingly compelling directive. But I didn't have the key. My key. The missing brass key. It was gone, lost, vanished into thin air, or perhaps into that dark, echoing space from my dream. Frustration surged through me, mixed with a growing sense of panic. Had I come this far, been drawn this deep into the mystery, only to be stopped by a locked drawer and a missing key? Then, a thought flickered in my mind, a desperate, almost illogical idea. Spare keys, I was meticulous, remember. I had spare keys for everything. My apartment, my car, even my mailbox. What about spare keys? Keys to things I no longer own. Keys to things I'd forgotten. Keys to anything. I turned away from the dresser, my mind racing, my heart pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. The wooden dish. The dish on my dresser, where I used to keep the missing key. Where I kept all my random trinkets, my spare change, my spare keys. Could it be? Could it be that I had another spare key, another antique key, tucked away in that dish, forgotten, unnoticed, waiting for this moment? I rushed back to the dresser, my hands trembling as I grabbed the wooden dish, turning it upside down, emptying its contents onto the dresser top. Spare change, cufflinks, buttons, paper clips, and then nestled amongst the clutter, almost hidden beneath a pile of pennies, I saw it. Another key. Small, brass, antique-looking, with a simple, almost ornate design on the head. Almost identical to the missing key, but different. subtly different. This key was slightly smaller, slightly more tarnished. The design on the head slightly more intricate, more unsettling. But it was a key that looked old antique brass. A key that might unlock the drawer. Hope surged through me, mixed with a renewed wave of fear. This was it. This was the moment of truth. This key, this drawer, this darkness, it all converged here in this room, in this moment. My hand trembled even more violently as I picked up the second key, holding it up to the light, examining it closely. It was cold, heavy, strangely alive in my hand. The metal seemed to pulse faintly, to vibrate with a low, almost imperceptible hum. The design on the head seemed to shift and writhe in my vision, like the symbols from my dreams. Like the whispers in the darkness. Ignoring the growing dread, the icy fear that was trying to paralyze me, I turned back to the dresser, to the locked drawer, to the waiting darkness. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hand shaking so violently I could barely hold the key. I inserted the key into the lock, the tarnished brass sliding smoothly into the H keyhole. It fit, too perfectly. A cold certainty washed over me. This was the key. This was the drawer. This was the moment of truth, the moment of revelation, the moment of consequence. I hesitated for a moment longer, my hand frozen on the key, my mind racing, my senses screaming me to stop, to turn back, to run, to escape, to leave the drawer locked, the secrets undisturbed, the darkness contained. But the whisper came again, louder than ever, a command, an irresistible force, pulling me forward, urging me onward, sealing my fate. Hope, and the whisper echoed, resonating through my mind, through my soul, through the very fabric of reality. Open the drawer. With a deep breath, a silent prayer, a final, desperate act of reckless curiosity, I turned the key. Slowly, deliberately, inexorably, I turned the key in the lock. There was a soft click, a faint snapping sound, like a bone breaking, a seal being broken, a barrier being breached. The lock clicked open. The drawer was unlocked. The darkness within was waiting. I pulled the drawer open, slowly, cautiously, my hand trembling, my eyes fixed on the opening gap, bracing myself for anything. Darkness poured out of the drawer, not just the absence of light, but a tangible darkness, a heavy, suffocating blackness that seemed to solidify in the air, to writhe and pulse like a living thing. The musty odor intensified, becoming overpowering, almost suffocating, mixed with a new scent, a sickly sweet, cloying aroma that smelled like decay, rotting flowers, death. And then I saw it, inside the drawer. Not darkness, not emptiness, but something. A small object, nestled in the center of the drawer, bathed in an unnatural, ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from the object itself, a soft, pulsing light that illuminated the darkness around it, revealing nothing else. Just the object and the darkness. It was a key. Another key. Identical to the missing key. Identical to the key in my hand, but different. More ornate, more ancient looking, the brass darker, more tarnished, the design on the head more intricate, more unsettling, almost alive. It pulsed with that same ethereal light, that same unsettling hum, but amplified here, intensified, almost beckoning. And then I understood, the lost item. It wasn't just a key, it was the key. The key I had been searching for, the key for my dreams. The key that had been calling to me, drawing me here, leading me to this drawer, to this darkness, to this thing. The key in the drawer. It wasn't just a key, it was the source of the missing key. The original, the master key. And the drawer wasn't just a drawer, it was a container. A prison, a seal, holding something inside. Something that had been locked away, hidden, forgotten for a long, long time. And now I had opened it. I had unlocked the drawer. I had released whatever was inside. The whisper came again, louder than ever, triumphant, exultant, chillingly satisfied. Open-eyed. The whisper echoed, resonating through the room, through the apartment, through my very soul. Open the door. The key in the drawer pulsed brighter, the ethereal light intensifying, the darkness around it swirling, coalescing, taking shape. And from the drawer, from the darkness, from the light, something started to emerge. Something lost, something found, something coming for me. Story 7, my name is Jake, and I've always been drawn to the wild. Not the tame, manicured wilderness of city parks, but the real deal, the kind that bites back. Growing up in the shadow of the Rockies, I learned to hike before I learned to drive. My dad, a grizzled old park ranger, instilled in me a respect for nature, but also a healthy dose of fear. He'd tell me stories around the campfire, tales not of bears and mountain lions, but of something else. Whispers of hikers vanishing without a trace, of trails that shifted when you weren't looking, of a cold dread that settled over the mountains when the storms rolled in. I used to scoff, chalking it up to old-timer folklore. Now I'm not so sure. See, I'm a storm chaser, not the kind with fancy vans and radar equipment, but the boots, on the ground adrenaline, junkie type. I live for the raw power of nature unleashed. Hurricanes, blizzards, thunderstorms, they don't scare me, they excite me. There's a primal thrill in standing at the edge of chaos, feeling the wind scream and the rain lash, knowing you're facing something bigger than yourself. Stupid. Maybe. Absolutely. This particular obsession started a few years back. I was hiking the Lost Creek Wilderness in Colorado, a place known for its beauty, sure, but also for its unpredictable weather. A storm blew in fast, catching me higher up than I should have been. Most people would have panicked, scrambled for cover. Me, I felt alive. The lightning cracked around me, illuminating the jagged peaks and strobe like flashes. The wind howled like a banshee, trying to rip me off the mountainside. Rain turned the trail into a slick, muddy mess. And I was grinning, heart pounding, soaked to the bone, utterly exhilarated. I made it down, of course, battered and bruised, but buzzing with an energy I couldn't shake. That storm had changed something in me. It wasn't just the adrenaline, it was something else, something deeper. It was like the storm had called to me, and I'd answered. Ever since then, I've been chasing that feeling, seeking out the heart of every tempest, pushing myself further each time, which brings me to the Cascades, Washington State, towering peaks, dense forests, and weather that can turn on you in a heartbeat. Perfect storm, chasing territory. I've been watching the forecast for days, tracking a particularly nasty system barreling in off the Pacific. The weather reports were dire, flash flood warnings, high winds, potential for landslides. Park rangers were advising against hiking, especially in the higher elevations. Perfect, I thought. I'd chosen the Skyline Trail, a grueling climb that promised panoramic views if you could get above the cloud line. Even on a good day, it was a challenging hike, steep and relentless. But with a storm brewing, it was borderline reckless. My dad would have grounded me for life if he knew what I was planning. But I couldn't resist. The pull was too strong. It was like the mountains themselves were whispering my name, beckoning me into the teeth of the storm. I packed my gear, waterproof everything, extra layers, emergency beacon, enough food and water to last me a couple of days if things went south. I told my roommate I was heading out for a day hike, knowing full well I'd be pushing it much further than that. No need to worry him. He would understand anyway. The morning dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with humidity. As I drove to the trailhead, the first fat raindrops began to splatter on the windshield. A good omen, I told myself. Or maybe a final warning. I ignored the knowing feeling in my gut, the little voice that whispered, "Turn back." I was Jake, the storm chaser. Fear wasn't in my vocabulary. The trailhead parking lot was deserted, save for my beat-up Jeep. Good. I preferred solitude anyway. I hoisted my pack, took a deep breath of the damp, pine-scented air, and stepped onto the Skyline Trail. The forest canopy closed in around me, swallowing the already dim light. The trees dripped with moisture, and the trail was slick with mud and fallen leaves. It was eerily quiet, the usual forest chatter of birds and squirrels muted, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. As I climbed, the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves overhead, then build into a steady roar. The rain intensified, soaking through my waterproof jacket despite its promises. The trail steepened, switchbacking relentlessly up the mountainside. I pushed on, driven by that familiar thrill, the anticipation of the storm's full fury. After a couple of hours of hard climbing, I broke through the tree line. The world exploded. The wind hit me like a physical force, almost knocking me off my feet. The rain was no longer rain, it was a stinging barrage of icy pellets. Visibility dropped to near zero. The panoramic views promised by the trail map were non-existent, swallowed by a swirling gray chaos. Most sane people would have turned around right then and there. But I wasn't most people. I was a storm chaser. And this was exactly what I'd come for. I pulled my hood tighter, lowered my head against the wind, and kept climbing. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint scar on the mountainside disappearing into the swirling mist. I relied on instinct, on the faint tread marks in the mud, to guide me forward. Then, I heard it. A sound that cut through the roar of the wind and rain. A sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. Faint, distorted, carried on the wind, but undeniably a voice, calling my name. Jacob. It was just the wind, I told myself. The wind playing tricks. But the voice, it sounded so close, so personal. Like it knew me, like it was calling specifically to me. Jacob Loader this time, clearer, closer. I stopped, heart hammering against my ribs, scanning the swirling gray nothingness around me. There was nothing there. Just the wind, the rain, the endless gray. But the voice, Jake, had come closer. This time it wasn't just the wind. This time it was inside my head, a cold, insidious whisper resonating deep within my skull. And it wasn't just calling my name, it was pulling me, drawing me further up the mountain, deeper into the heart of the storm. And for the first time, a sliver of real fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the adrenaline rush. This wasn't just a storm. This was something else, something wrong. And I was alone, miles from civilization, with no one to hear me scream. The voice in my head was a low hum at first, a subtle vibration against my skull, easily dismissed as the wind's resonance or the drumming of rain. But it was persistent, insistent, growing stronger with each step I took higher. Closer, it urged, a chilling whisper that seemed to bypass my ears entirely, burrowing directly into my thoughts. I tried to rationalize it. Altitude sickness, exposure. Maybe the storm was messing with my head, playing tricks on my senses. But deep down, I knew it was none of those things. This was something other, something unnatural. Ignoring the increasingly frantic warnings of my inner voice, I pressed on. The storm wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a lure, a siren song pulling me deeper into its embrace. And despite the growing dread coiling in my stomach, a morbid curiosity, a twisted sense of daredevil kept me moving forward. I was Jake the Storm Chaser, remember. Turning back now would be admitting defeat, admitting fear. And fear was a weakness I couldn't afford to acknowledge, not even to myself. The landscape was becoming increasingly alien. The trees, already stunted and twisted at this elevation, were now contorted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The rocks were slick with a moss that seemed to pulse with a faint, phosphorescent glow in the gloom. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a static charge that made my skin prickle and my teeth ache. The trail, what little remained of it, had vanished completely. I was scrambling over loose scree and boulders, relying on a compass bearing and sheer stubbornness to keep me headed upwards. Visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. The wind howled relentlessly, a deafening shriek that threatened to tear me apart. The rain was relentless, stinging my face, blurring my vision, soaking me to the core despite my so-called waterproof gear. And the voice, it was louder now, clearer, more insistent. No longer just a whisper, but a distinct, chilling tone, resonating within my very bones. Almost there, just a little further. It was laced with a strange kind of hunger, a predatory anticipation that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just calling me, it was expecting me. As I stumbled blindly through the swirling mist, I noticed something else, something even more unsettling than the voice. The silence. Not the complete absence of sound, but a selective silence. The wind still roared, the rain still lashed, but the natural sounds of the mountain were gone. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves, no scurrying of small creatures. Just the storm, the voice, and an oppressive, unnatural quiet that pressed in on me from all sides. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. Then, through a momentary thinning of the mist, I saw it, or rather, I felt it first. A shift in the air pressure, a sudden drop in temperature, a palpable sense of presence. And then, the mist parted just enough to reveal a shape looming ahead. It was a structure of some kind, silhouetted against the swirling gray sky. Too angular, too deliberate to be a natural rock formation. It looked built. A tower, perhaps, or some kind of edifice. I couldn't make out details, just a dark, imposing shape against the storm-racked sky. The voice intensified, a triumphant crescendo in my mind. Yes, there come to me. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a command laced with an almost unbearable anticipation. And despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, I found myself drawn towards it, compelled by a force I couldn't understand, couldn't resist. My legs moved as if on their own accord, carrying me forward through the storm. The ground underfoot changed again, becoming smoother, almost paved. The air grew colder, drier, the oppressive humidity replaced by a biting, unnatural chill. The silence deepened, becoming absolute, swallowing even the roar of the wind. It was like stepping out of the storm and into something else. As I drew closer, the shape resolved itself, becoming clearer through the thinning mist. It wasn't a tower. It wasn't a building. It was a chair. A massive chair, carved from black stone, perched precariously on the edge of a precipice. It was colossal, at least 20 feet high, its backrest reaching into the swirling clouds. It looked ancient, monolithic, radiating an aura of cold, malevolent power. And on the chair, silhouetted against the storm-torn sky, sat a figure. I couldn't make out details, just a dark, indistinct shape, draped in what looked like flowing robes, its head obscured by a deep cowl. But I could feel its presence, radiating outwards like a physical force, a wave of cold, predatory energy that washed over me, paralyzing me in place. The voice, now emanating not just from inside my head, but seemingly from the figure itself, resonated with a chilling satisfaction. You came. It rasped, the sound like stones grinding together, laced with an undercurrent of something ancient and utterly wrong. I knew you would. I tried to speak, to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in place, staring at the figure on the chair, the storm swirling around it like a macabre hollow. The fear that had been a sliver before now blossomed in a full-blown terror, a primal dread that threatened to consume me entirely. You hear the storm, don't you, Jake? The voice continued, the rasping tones echoing in the unnatural silence. You feel its power, its call. It paused, and I could sense, rather than see, a slow, deliberate movement, a tilting of the cowled head in my direction. It calls to those who understand it, those who crave it. You are one of us, Jake. The voice hissed, the words like icy needles piercing my mind. A storm chaser, a seeker of chaos. You have come to the right place. And then, for the first time, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised a hand, skeletal fingers emerging from the flowing robes. It pointed at me, a long, bony finger, and the voice echoed in my mind with a chilling finality. No, you will become the storm. The moment the figure pointed, a jolt, colder than the mountain wind, ripped through me. It wasn't pain, not exactly, but a violent unraveling, like my very being was being torn apart at the seams. My vision blurred, the imposing chair and the cowled figure dissolving into swirling chaos. The voice no longer just in my head, but becoming my head, roared, become the storm. My skin prickled, then burned, then felt like it was dissolving, replaced by something else. I looked down at my hands, or where my hands should have been, and saw not flesh and bone, but swirling tendrils of mist, crackling with faint blue energy. The waterproof jacket, my hiking boots, my very clothes, they were all dissolving, becoming insubstantial, merging with the storm itself. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at what was left of my mind. This wasn't exhilaration. This wasn't adrenaline. This was annihilation. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, just a rush of wind, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. My body, my solid, human form, was disintegrating, being replaced by the raw elements of the storm. The rain was no longer falling on me, it was falling from me, coalescing from my dissolving flesh, icy droplets born of my terror. The wind wasn't just howling around me, it was howling through me, rushing through the hollow spaces where my lungs used to be, a mournful, endless cry. My thoughts, once coherent and linear, fractured, becoming scattered fragments, wisps of memory caught in the gale. Images flashed through my fading consciousness, my dad's campfire stories. The exhilaration of that first storm in Lost Creek, the thrill of the chase, the knowing feeling of dread I'd ignored. They were all dissolving, becoming meaningless, swept away by the rising tide of the storm's consciousness. The figure on the chair remained, a dark, silent sentinel at the heart of the tempest, watching as I was consumed, as I became one with the chaos. I could feel its satisfaction, a cold, ancient hunger being sated. It had called and I had answered. And now I was paying the ultimate price. As my human form faded completely, as the last vestiges of Jake, the storm chaser, dissolved into the tempest, something else began to coalesce. A new awareness, vast and impersonal, began to form within the storm. It wasn't me anymore, not Jake, not the storm chaser, but something more. Something other. I was the wind, the rain, the lightning, the thunder. I was the cold dread that settled over the mountains when the storms rolled in. I was the whisper in the trees, the moan of the wind through the peaks, the sudden, terrifying crack of thunder that echoed through the valleys. I was the storm itself. And in that vast, impersonal consciousness, I understood. The figure on the chair, the voice that had called me, it was a part of the storm too, a focal point, a consciousness within the chaos. It was the storm's shepherd, its guardian, its collector. It sought out those who were drawn to the storm's power, those who craved its chaos, those foolish enough to chase it into its heart. And it transformed them, consumed them, added them to the storm's ever-growing consciousness. We were many, I realized, a multitude of lost souls, storm chasers and thrill seekers, fools and daredevils, all consumed and integrated into the storm's vast, uncaring being. We were the wind's whispers, the rain's tears, the thunder's rage. We were the storm's voices, calling out to others, luring them into the same deadly embrace. And the storm, it was hungry, craved more. It craved more. More souls to consume, more consciousness to absorb, more power to wield. It would continue to call, to whisper, to lure, until the mountains were littered with the bones of those who had answered its call. The last vestiges of Jake the human flickered within the storm's consciousness, a fading ember of memory and regret. I remembered my dad's warnings, his campfire tales of hikers vanishing without a trace. I remembered scoffing, dismissing them as folklore. Now, I understood. They weren't just stories, they were warnings. Warnings I had foolishly ignored. And now it was too late. Jake was gone, swallowed by the storm. His consciousness fragmented, his identity lost, forever bound to the tempestuous heart of the mountains. The storm remained vast and indifferent, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to answer its call. Waiting to claim another victim, to add another voice to its chilling chorus. The storm still rages in the Cascades, they say. Hikers still go missing, vanishing without a trace, especially when the weather turns bad. Park rangers still warn people to stay away from the higher elevations when a storm is brewing. But some, the storm chasers, the thrill seekers, the ones who crave the chaos, they don't listen. They can't resist the call. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the rain lashes against your window, if you listen very carefully, you might just hear it. A faint whisper on the wind, carried on the storm, calling your name. Come closer. And if you listen too closely, if you answer that call, you might just find yourself becoming part of the storm too. Just another voice in the endless, chilling chorus of the tempest, forever lost in the heart of the mountains. Story 8, my name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the wild. Not in some romantic Thor-esque way, mind you. More like a morbid curiosity, a need to poke at the edges of what's comfortable and safe. City life, with its sterile predictability, always felt like a cage to me. The real world, the raw, untamed one, that's where things got interesting, and maybe, just maybe, a little scary. This time, my itch for the wild had led me to the Blackwood Forest. I'd stumbled upon it while scrolling through some obscure hiking forums, buried deep in threads about places you shouldn't go alone. The forum posts were vague, mostly whispers and rumors. Locals apparently kept their distance, muttering about strange occurrences and disappearances. Naturally, that just made me want to go more. The Blackwood Forest wasn't too far from civilization, technically. A few hours' drive from my apartment, nestled in a pocket of old-growth wilderness that time seemed to have forgotten. It wasn't a national park, or even a state one. Just there. Unmarked, unmaintained, and largely unvisited, according to the scant information I could find. Perfect. I was testing out some new gear on this trip. See, I'm also a bit of a gear junkie. Always chasing the latest tech, the lightest materials, the edge and outdoor equipment. This time, it was a brand new, ultralight backpack tent combo, some experimental water purification tablets, and a fancy GPS watch that promised to track everything from my heart rate to the barometric pressure. All untested, all cutting edge, and all in theory. Designed to make my life easier in the backcountry. What could go wrong? Famous last words, I know. The trailhead was easy enough to find, if you could call it that. Just a muddy pull off on the side of a barely, their logging road, marked by a weathered wooden sign that was more rot than paint. Blackwood Forest, enter at your own risk, it declared, in faded, almost mocking letters. Charming. The air was thick and heavy, even for early morning. Late summer in this part of the country meant humidity you could practically chew on. The trees pressed in close on either side of the trailhead, ancient pines and gnarled oaks, their branches interwoven to form a dense canopy that swallowed the sunlight. Even at midday, I knew the forest floor would be perpetually twilight. I hosted my pack, the untested gear feeling surprisingly light on my shoulders. Too light, maybe. I shrugged off the thought. Lighter is better, right? That's what all the gear reviews said anyway. I adjusted the straps, double-checked my water bottles, and took a deep breath of the damp, earthy air. It smelled old, like damp soil and decaying leaves, but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. Something almost metallic, maybe. Or was that just my imagination getting ahead of me? The trail, if you could call it that, was barely discernible, overgrown with ferns and moss. It looked more like a deer path than anything meant for human feet. Good. Less chance of running into anyone. I preferred solitude on these trips. People were noisy, unpredictable. The forest, at least, was honest in its indifference. I started walking. The crunch of my boots on the leaf litter the only sound besides the drone of insects and the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. The GPS watch beeped, confirming a satellite lock. All systems go, it chirped in a cheerful, synthesized voice. I hoped it was right. The first hour was uneventful. Pleasantly so, even. The forest was beautiful in a brooding, gothic kind of way. Sunlight filtered down in fractured beams, illuminating patches of moss and highlighting the intricate patterns of bark on the ancient trees. It was easy to see why people were drawn to places like this, despite the whispers of unease. There was a certain power here, a sense of something ancient and watchful. Then, I made my first bad decision. It wasn't a dramatic one, not at first. Just a slight detour, really. The trail I was following had pittered out completely, disappearing into a tangle of fallen logs and thorny bushes. According to my map app, though, the official trail, if such a thing even existed, was just a little ways to the east. A short bushwhack, and I'd be back on track. Or what I assumed was the track. Looking back, I should have just turned around, retraced my steps, and tried to find where I'd lost the path. But no, my ego, and maybe a little bit of that morbid curiosity, wouldn't let me. A little detour never hurt anyone, I muttered to myself, pushing aside a curtain of ferns and stepping off the barley, their trail and into the deeper woods. The moment I left the faint trace of the path, the forest seemed to change. The light dimmed further, and the air grew colder, heavier. The sounds of insects faded, replaced by a profound, unsettling silence. Even the rustling in the undergrowth stopped. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. I pushed on, relying on my GPS watch to guide me east. The undergrowth was thick, grabbing at my boots and pack. Thorns snagged at my clothes. The ground underfoot was uneven, hidden by layers of decaying leaves, and I stumbled more than once. The cheerful voice of the GPS watch, still chirping about satellite locks and heart rates, started to sound mocking. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, I broke through the thick undergrowth into a small clearing. Relief flooded through me. Clearing meant trail, right? Civilization, or at least the illusion of it, couldn't be far. But as I stepped into the clearing, my relief died in my throat. This wasn't a natural clearing. The trees around it were too perfectly spaced, too unnaturally uniform. And in the center of the clearing there was something else. It was a circle. A perfect circle etched into the forest floor. Not with stones or wood or anything solid. Just absence. A ring of bare earth devoid of vegetation, as if something had burned away everything that had dared to grow there. The soil inside the circle was dark, almost black, and it looked wrong. Dead. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. This wasn't natural. This wasn't just some overgrown trail. This was something else entirely. And as I stood there in the unnatural silence of the clearing, a new sound reached my ears. Faint at first, but growing steadily louder. A low rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, but too slow, too deep, and definitely not my own. My untested gear suddenly felt a lot less reassuring. And my bad decision, well, it was starting to feel like it might be more than just a detour. It felt like I'd stepped off the path and into something I wasn't supposed to find. Something that was now very definitely aware of me. The thumping grew louder, resonating not just in my ears but in my chest, a deep, sluggish pulse that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my boots. It wasn't a natural sound, not like any animal I knew. It was too regular, too deliberate, and far too low frequency to be anything living and breathing in a normal way. It felt ancient, primordial. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my bravado. This wasn't just spooky woods anymore. This was something genuinely, profoundly wrong. My carefully curated image of myself as a fearless explorer started to crumble, replaced by a much more basic, primal instinct: get out. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to scramble back through the undergrowth, to find that barely their trail and run until I was back at my car, back in civilization, back anywhere that felt safe and normal. But my feet were rooted to the spot. Curiosity, that morbid fascination that had drawn me to this place in the first place, held me captive. And something else, too. A strange, insidious pull emanating from the circle itself. The circle. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was perfectly round, an unnatural geometry in the chaotic sprawl of the forest. The bare earth within it was blacker than shadow, and it seemed to absorb light. The fractured sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy seemed to bend and twist as it approached the circle, only to vanish completely once it crossed the invisible boundary. It was like looking into a hole in reality, a void in the fabric of the world. I took a tentative step closer, my hiking boots crunching on the dry leaves at the edge of the clearing. The thumping intensified, and I could feel it now, not just hear it. A vibration that ran up my legs, through my spine, settling in my gut with a sickening lurch. It was making me nauseous. My GPS watch, bless its cheerful, oblivious heart, continued to chirp away, displaying satellite data and elevation readings. It was utterly useless, a plastic toy in the face of something ancient and unknowable. I fumbled for my phone, thinking maybe I could get a signal, call for help, anything. But of course, there was nothing. No bars. No service, just the cold, dead screen reflecting my own increasingly pale face. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. And whatever was in this forest, whatever was making that sound, it knew I was here. Driven by a morbid impulse I couldn't explain, I took another step closer to the circle. Then another. Each step was heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening, resisting my movement. The thumping pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. Or maybe it was the other way around. I couldn't tell anymore. My senses were blurring, the edges of reality starting to fray. I reached the edge of the bare earth circle. The line was sharp, distinct, as if drawn with a knife. One foot on the normal forest floor, the other hovering over the black soil of the circle. The temperature difference was immediate and shocking. The air within the circle was freezing, a bone, deep cold that seeped through my hiking boots and into my bones. It was a cold that felt unnatural, not the cold of winter, but the cold of autumn. I hesitated, my hand outstretched, hovering over the black earth. Should I touch it? What would happen? Common sense screamed at me to back away, to run, to never look back. But that damn curiosity, that morbid pull, was too strong. I had to know. Slowly, trembling, I lowered my hand. My fingers brushed the surface of the black soil. It was dry, powdery, and colder than ice. As my fingertips made contact, the thumping sound abruptly stopped. Silence descended, absolute and profound. A silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure, crushing my eardrums. And then, something moved within the circle. Not a rustle, not a stir, but a slow, deliberate shifting of the black earth. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like dust settling or sand shifting in a breeze. But there was no breeze, and this wasn't settling dust. This was purposeful. The black earth began to ripple, like water disturbed by something rising from beneath. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was organic, fleshy, but not like anything I recognized. It was pale, almost translucent, with a slick, wet sheen. It pulsed faintly with the same slow, rhythmic beat I had been hearing. As it rose further from the black earth, the shape began to resolve itself. It was long, serpentine, and impossibly thin, like a pale, fleshy cord, coiling and uncoiling in slow motion. It had no discernible features, no head, no limbs, just this endless, pale length of something. The silence broke, shattered by a new sound. A wet, sucking sound, like something being pulled from thick mud. The pale cord continued to rise, and I saw now that it was attached to something beneath the black earth. Something vast and unseen, hidden in the darkness. The sucking sound intensified, and the pale cord began to lengthen, rising higher and higher from the circle. It was impossibly long, stretching up towards the canopy, disappearing into the gloom above. And as it rose, it began to change. The pale flesh started to darken, veins of black spreading across its surface like ink in water. The slick sheen intensified, becoming almost oily, reflecting the fractured sunlight in grotesque, distorted patterns. And a smell began to rise from the circle, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn, like rotting meat and something else. Something vaguely floral but corrupted, twisted into something full and unnatural. I was frozen, paralyzed by a terror so profound it transcended fear. This wasn't just scary. This was wrong. Fundamentally, existentially wrong. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to categorize it, to make sense of it. But there was no category for this, no explanation. It was simply other. The pale cord, now black-veined and glistening, reached its full length. It hung there, suspended above the circle, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel, and then slowly, deliberately it began to turn, to face me. And as it turned, I saw it. At the very end of the cord, where I had expected nothing, there was an opening. A gaping maw lined with rows of needle-sharp teeth, too many teeth arranged in patterns that defied geometry. And in the center of the maw, a single, unblinking eye. Pale, milky white, and fixed directly on me. Recognition flared in that eye. Not human recognition, not understanding, but something colder, older, and infinitely more predatory. It knew I was there. It had been waiting for me. And now it was ready. The maw opened wider, impossibly wide, and a sound emerged from its depths. Not a roar, not a scream, but a wet, gurgling sigh. A sound that promised pain and oblivion and something far, far worse. And as the sound washed over me, the untested jeer on my back suddenly felt like the least of my worries. My bad decision had led me here, to this place, to this thing. And I knew with a chilling certainty that there was no turning back. The gurgling sigh washed over me, and it felt like a physical force, pushing, probing, invading. My breath hitched in my throat, and my legs finally unlocked. Run. That was the only thought left in my mind, a primal imperative overriding everything else. I spun around, scrambling back the way I'd come, desperate to put distance between myself and the circle, the thing, the eye. But the forest had changed again. The undergrowth, which had been merely thick and annoying before, was now a tangled, grasping web, snagging at my boots, tripping me, holding me back. Thorns, sharper and longer than before, tore at my clothes, drawing blood. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, blocking my path. I stumbled, fell, scrambled back to my feet, and ran again, blindly, desperately, not caring about direction, only about escape. The thumping was back, louder now, faster, chasing me through the trees. And behind it, the wet, sucking sound, closer, closer. My untested gear, the ultralight backpack tent combo, the experimental water purification tablets, the fancy GPS watch, none of it mattered now. It was all useless, irrelevant in the face of this primal terror. The cutting-edge technology, the promises of comfort and convenience, were meaningless here in the heart of the Blackwood forest. I was stripped bare, reduced to my most basic instincts, survival and fear. I risked a glance back over my shoulder. Through the trees, I could see it, the pale cord, moving with impossible speed, weaving through the branches, closing the distance between us. The maw was still open, the milky white eye still fixed on me, burning into my soul. Panic lent me a burst of adrenaline. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the stitch in my side, the agonizing stabs of thorns tearing at my skin. I had to get away. I had to escape. I burst out of the thick undergrowth and into another clearing. Not a circle this time, thank God, just a normal, if overgrown, forest clearing. But in the center of it, something else. A structure, ramshackle, decaying, but undeniably built by human hands. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. The roof had collapsed in on itself, the walls were rotting and covered in moss, and the windows were long gone, leaving gaping, empty sockets staring out at the forest. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe centuries. But it was shelter, a solid structure, However dilapidated was better than nothing. Maybe, just maybe, I could barricade myself inside, buy myself some time, figure out what to do. It was a desperate hope, but it was all I had. I ran towards the cabin, stumbling over fallen logs and overgrown weeds. The thumping was still behind me, but fainter now, as if the thing was hesitating or toying with me. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I reached the cabin and threw myself against the rotting wooden door. It groaned open with a sound like a dying animal, revealing a dark, musty interior. I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind me, fumbling for some kind of latch, anything to secure it. There was none, just a rotted frame and rusted hinges. The cabin was even worse inside than it looked from the outside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the gloom was almost absolute. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that penetrated the collapsed roof, illuminating cobwebs thick as shrouds and furniture that had long since succumbed to rot. It was cold. Colder even than the circle clearing, and the silence here was heavy, oppressive. But it was shelter. For now, I leaned against the door, panting, listening. The thumping had stopped again. The sucking sound was gone. Silence, but not the unnatural silence of the circle. This was just empty. Dead. I took a tentative step further into the cabin, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. There was a fireplace, or rather, the crumbling remains of one in one corner. A table half collapsed in the center of the room. And in the far corner, something else, a bed, or what had once been a bed. Just a rotted wooden frame and a sagging, moldy mattress. But on the mattress, something that made my blood run cold. A skeleton. Not a full skeleton, not intact. Just scattered bones, bleached white with age, lying in a jumbled heap on the mattress. A skull grinning out at me from the gloom. Ribs, vertebrae, femurs, all mixed together like discarded toys, and amongst the bones, scraps of cloth rotted and faded, but still recognizable as clothing. Hiking clothes. My hiking clothes. Or clothes just like mine. The same brand, the same style, the same gear. Scattered amongst the bones were fragments of metal, plastic, and fabric. The remnants of untested gear. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just some abandoned cabin. This was a trap, a lure. Left here for people like me. Gear junkies, thrill seekers drawn to the wild. Lured by the whispers of the Blackwood Forest. And the untested gear it wasn't meant to help me survive, was meant to mark me, to identify me, to make me prey. The thumping started again, closer this time right outside the cabin walls. And the sucking sound too, wet and eager, just beyond the rotting door. It was here. It had found me. I backed away from the bed, from the bones, from the horrifying realization. My untested gear suddenly felt heavy, constricting, a brand on my skin. The GPS watch beeped cheerfully on my wrist, still tracking satellites, still oblivious to the horror closing in. I ripped it off, threw it to the floor, watched as it bounced and skittered across the dusty boards, finally coming to rest amongst the bones. It was useless. All of it was useless. The gear, the technology, the bravado, the curiosity. All of it had led me here to this cabin, to this end. The door groaned again, louder this time, as something pushed against it from the outside. The rotting wood splintered, cracked. A pale tendril, black, veined and glistening, snaked its way through the gap, probing, searching. I closed my eyes, waiting. There was nothing left to do. No escape, no fight, no untested gear that could save me now. Just the cold, the dark, the smell of decay, and the wet, sucking sound growing closer. My bad decision, my morbid curiosity had run its course. And the Blackwood Forest, it was ready to collect its due. Story 9, my name is Jake, and I've always been drawn to the wild. Not in some romantic, Thor-esque way, mind you. More like a moth to a flickering porch light on a summer night, stupid. Instinctual, and probably going to end with me getting zapped. City life with its concrete veins and neon pulse always felt like a cage. I needed green dirt, the rustle of leaves that wasn't just the wind tunnel between skyscrapers. So, every chance I got, I ditched the grid and head for the hills. Literally. Hiking was my escape valve. The steeper the climb, the better. The more isolated the trail, the more I felt like I could actually breathe. It wasn't just about the views, although those were a nice bonus. It was the quiet, the feeling of being small against something ancient and immense, that really got to me. And yeah, maybe a little bit of the thrill of pushing myself, testing my limits. I wasn't some adrenaline junkie, but I liked knowing I could handle myself out there, away from the easy comforts of civilization. This particular trip, though, was supposed to be different. It was supposed to beat easy. A chill weekend jaunt, a recharge hike as my girlfriend, Sarah, called it. Sarah, bless her heart, was the opposite of me in almost every way. City through and through, loved brunch more than backpacking, and considered roughing it to be a hotel without room service. But she was trying. She knew I needed these trips, and she was actually genuinely trying to get into it. So we picked a trail in the Redwood National Park. The Coastal Trail, they called it. Scenic, relatively flat, supposed to be teeming with wildlife. Think of the Instagrams, Jake. Sarah had chirped, scrolling through photos of towering trees and sun-dappled beaches. I'd rolled my eyes, but secretly, I was looking forward to it. A change of pace, maybe, and, spending time with Sarah outside of our usual routine. We packed up the car on a Friday afternoon, city smog giving way to hazy mountain air as we drove north. Sarah was in charge of snacks, which usually meant a gourmet assortment of trail mix and artisanal granola bars. I handled the real food, dehydrated meals, some jerky, the usual hiker fare. Except this time, I decided to try something different. I'd been reading some survivalist blogs lately, just for kicks. One of them had this whole section on wild edibles, plants you could forage and eat right off the trail. Netcher's grocery store. The blogger had proclaimed, with a picture of himself grinning like a maniac next to a bush of what looked suspiciously like poison ivy. Still, the idea had stuck in my head. What if, just for this trip, I tried to supplement our packed food with stuff we found along the way? A little bit of living off the land, just to spice things up. Stupid idea, I know. Even as it formed in my brain, a little voice was screaming, "Jake, you can barely identify a dandelion, let alone a safe to eat wild plant." But the adventure part of my brain was louder. It whispered about self-reliance, about connecting with nature on a deeper level, about how cool it would be to tell people we'd forage part of our dinner. Ego, mostly. And maybe a tiny dumb spark of curiosity. So, I did it. I researched online for about 15 minutes, skimming through articles about edible plants in Redwood National Park. I printed out a couple of blurry pictures of things called Munner's lettuce and salmon berries. Sounded appetizing enough, right? And stuffed them in my backpack. I figured, worst case, we just wouldn't find anything, or I'd chicken out and stick to the dehydrated stuff. No harm, no foul. Sarah, of course, was oblivious to my little experiment. She was too busy curating her hiking playlist and meticulously packing her trail glam, kit sunscreen, lip balm, a tiny mirror, the works. I just smiled to myself, imagining her face when I presented her with a freshly foraged salad or whatever the hell miner's lettuce was supposed to be. "See, Sarah," I'd say, all smug and outdoorsy. "Nature provides." We arrived at the trailhead late Friday night, set up our tent in the designated campsite, and crashed. The air was crisp and pines scented, and for a while, I actually felt that recharge I think Sarah was talking about. But even as I drifted off to sleep, a tiny, nagging unease started to prickle at the edges of my mind. It wasn't just the usual pre-hike jitters. It was something else, something off. Maybe it was the shadows stretching long and distorted in the firelight, or the way the wind seemed to whisper through the redwoods like a sigh. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the faint, unsettling feeling that I was about to make a really, really bad decision. And that decision, I knew, had something to do with the stupid, half-baked plan rattling around in my backpack, right next to the blurry pictures of Netcher's grocery store. The morning dawned crisp and deceptively cheerful. Sunlight, fractured by the redwood canopy, dappled the forest floor in shifting mosaics of light and shadow. Birds chirped. A creek gurgled nearby, nature's soundtrack, perfectly engineered to lull you into a false sense of security. Sarah predictably was in her element. She'd shed her city skin overnight, transforming into outdoorsy Sarah, complete with a wide, brimmed hat and hiking boots that looked suspiciously brand new. She was snapping photos of everything ferns unfurling, dew clinging to spiderwebs, even a particularly photogenic pine cone. "This is so wholesome," she declared, inhaling deeply. I just grunted in agreement, fiddling with my backpack straps and trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. We set off down the trail, Sarah leading the charge, chattering about the amazing air quality and how grounding it was to be away from cell service. I trailed behind, scanning the undergrowth, my blurry plant printouts clutched in my sweaty hand. Miner's lettuce apparently looked like little green discs. Salmon berries like, well, salmon-colored berries. Groundbreaking botanical knowledge, I know. The first hour was uneventful. The trail was easy, mostly flat, winding through groves of towering redwoods that blotted out the sky. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. It was beautiful in a cathedral-like way, but also a little oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, and the silence was broken only by our footsteps and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept expecting to see some kind of wildlife, a deer, a squirrel, maybe even one of those banana slugs Sarah was obsessed with finding. But the forest remained stubbornly, eerily empty. Then, saw a patch of low, growing plants with small, round, green leaves. Discs. Miner's lettuce discs. My heart skipped a beat. "Sarah, hold up," I called, trying to sound casual. She stopped, turning to me with a questioning look. "What is it, bear?" "Nah, just nature," I stammered, pointing vaguely at the patch of plants. Remember, I was reading about edible plants. I think this might be Miner's lettuce." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Edible? You mean like we can eat it?" There was a distinct note of skepticism in her voice. "Yeah, supposedly. It's supposed to be lemony, good in salads." I knelt down, pulling out my crumpled printout. The blurry picture did vaguely resemble the plants in front of me. Vaguely. "Jake, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern. "Like, really sure because I brought, a ton of snacks. We don't need to eat random weeds. Relax." "Sarah," I said, trying to project an air of confidence I definitely didn't feel. "It's just a little experiment, a taste. We're not going to replace our lunch with this stuff." I plucked a leaf, holding it up to the light. It did look lettucey. Sort of. And it didn't smell poisonous. See, harmless. I popped the leaf in my mouth and chewed. It tasted green, grassy, slightly bitter maybe, definitely not lemony. "Well," Sarah prompted, watching me with a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. "Is it nature's candy?" I swallowed, trying to keep a straight face. "Yeah, actually, not bad. Want to try?" Sarah wrinkled her nose. "No, I'm good. I'll stick with my trail mix." Smart woman. I shrugged, pretending to be unfazed by her lack of enthusiasm. More for me. Then, I proceeded to forage a handful of the leaves, stuffing them into a plastic baggie I brought for specimens. Yes, specimens. That sounded less idiotic than potential trail salad. "Okay, Miner's lettuce acquired," I announced, dusting off my knees. "Let's move on. Salmon berries next." Sarah just shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're going to get us both killed, you know that." We continued hiking, the trail gradually starting to climb. The redwoods thinned out a little, replaced by a mix of pines and ferns. The undergrowth became denser, more tangled, and then I saw them, bushes laden with berries, bright orange, almost glowing in the filtered sunlight. Salmon berries, or at least, I really, really hoped they were salmon berries. The picture in my printout was, again, blurry and ambiguous. These berries were the right color and roughly the right shape. But there were other berries in the forest, I knew that much. Berries that looked tempting. Berries that could also be very, very bad news. "Sarah, jackpot," I exclaimed, pointing at the bushes. "Salmon berries." Just like I said. Sarah squinted at the berries, then back at me, then back at the berries. "Those look awfully bright," she said slowly. "Are you sure those are the right ones?" "Positive-ish," I replied, hedging my bets slightly. "Color's right, shape's right, let's consult the expert." I pulled out the printout again, holding it next to the berry bush. See, twins. Sarah remained unconvinced. "Jake, I really don't like this. Can't we just eat the food we brought? The stuff we know is safe." "Where's your sense of adventure, Sarah?" I teased, plucking a berry. It was soft, juicy, and smelled faintly sweet. "Come on, live a little. One berry. What's the worst that could happen?" Famous last words, right? I popped the salmon berry into my mouth. It burst with juice, a flavor that was odd. Sweet, yes, but also kind of watery. and with a strange, slightly metallic aftertaste. Not exactly the deliciously sweet and slightly tart flavor the internet had promised, but not terrible, just weird. See, I said, swallowing. Perfectly fine. Want one now? Sarah still looked dubious, but this time, curiosity seemed to outweigh her caution. She hesitantly reached out and plucked a berry, examining it closely before popping it into her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes narrowed. She said finally, "It's interesting. Not exactly gourmet, but not bad, I guess." See, I crowed, feeling a surge of triumph. Nature's bounty, we are officially surviving off the land. Sarah rolled her eyes again, but I could tell she was grudgingly impressed. We spent the next few minutes picking salmon berries, filling another baggie with the bright orange fruit. We ate a few more as we hiked, the strange, metallic aftertaste lingering on my tongue. But I ignored it. I was too busy basking in my foraging glory, imagining the campfire feast we were going to have tonight, complete with forage salad and salmonberry dessert. I was so focused on my idiotic nature man fantasy that I completely missed the subtle shift in the forest around us. The way the trees seemed to lean in closer, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder, despite the sun still filtering weakly through the canopy. I didn't notice the silence that had fallen. Not just the natural quiet of the woods, but a heavy, expectant silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And I definitely didn't notice the first faint twinge in my stomach. A tiny, almost imperceptible cramp, like a warning whisper from my gut. A whisper I was too arrogant, too caught up in my own foolishness to hear. The stomach twinge was just the beginning. It started as a faint unease, easily dismissed as hunger pangs or maybe just nerves. But as we hiked further, the twinge intensified, morphing into a dull, persistent H. Sarah, still happily snapping photos of ferns, seemed oblivious. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the trail, the rhythm of my boots on the dirt, anything to distract myself from the growing discomfort in my gut. But the H was persistent, insistent, like a low, throbbing drumbeat in my abdomen. By the time we stopped for lunch, the dull H had sharpened into full-blown cramps. Waves of nausea rolled over me, making my head spin. The Minner's lettuce and salmon berries, still nestled in their plastic baggies, suddenly looked a lot less appealing. In fact, just the sight of them made my stomach churn. Sarah, unpacking our lunch, gourmet sandwiches, and organic fruit, finally noticed something was wrong. "Jake, you okay? You look kind of green," she said, her cheerful outdoorsy Sarah persona momentarily replaced by genuine concern. "Yeah, fine, just a little tired." I mumbled, trying to sit down without doubling over. Maybe the altitude. We weren't even at a particularly high elevation, but altitude sickness sounded plausible enough. "Here, eat something," Sarah offered, handing me a sandwich. "You'll feel better." I took the sandwich, forcing a smile, but the smell of the bread and fillings made my nausea worse. I managed a small bite, chewing mechanically, but the food felt like lead in my stomach. I quickly wrapped the rest of the sandwich back up, pushing it away. "Actually, I'm not that hungry," I said, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. "Maybe just some water." Sarah frowned, her concern deepening. "Jake, you're never not hungry on a hike. Seriously, what's wrong?" I hesitated, not wanting to admit my foraging folly. But the cramps were getting worse, sharper, radiating outwards from my stomach in sickening waves. Sweat broke out on my forehead, and a cold clamminess gripped my hands. I knew I couldn't hide it any longer. "Okay, maybe it's the plants," I confessed, wincing as another cramp clenched my insides. Sarah's eyes widened. "The plants? You mean the weeds and berries you ate?" There was a distinct "I told you so" tone in her voice, but I was too miserable to care. "Yeah," I admit, groaning. I think maybe they weren't as edible as advertised." Sarah stared at me, aghast. "Jake, are you serious? You ate random plants you found in the woods, without even knowing what they were? Are you trying to Darwin Award yourself?" "I researched them." I protested weakly, but even to me, it sounded pathetic. Sort online. For like 15 minutes, Sarah just buried her face in her hands, muttering something about idiots and natural selection. The next hour was a blur of pain and nausea. We tried to hike on, but I could barely manage a shuffle. Every step sent jolts of agony through my abdomen. My vision swam, and the forest around us seemed to warp and distort, the towering redwoods swaying like drunken giants. Sarah, bless her, was incredibly patient, helping me along, her arm around my waist, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by worried murmurs. "We need to turn back, Jake," she said finally, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get you out of here. Now." Turning back was the only option, but even the thought of retracing our steps, of hiking back down the trail, felt like an insurmountable task. Every muscle in my body ached, and my stomach felt like it was being twisted in a vise. As we slowly, agonizingly made our way back, the forest seemed to change around us. The cheerful sunlight of the morning had vanished, replaced by a heavy, oppressive gloom. The air grew colder, damper, and the silence deepened, becoming thick and suffocating. The birds had stopped chirping, the creek had fallen silent. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the crunch of our boots on the trail. And something else, a faint rustling sound just at the edge of hearing, like dry leaves skittering across the forest floor. But there was no wind. The rustling grew louder, closer, surrounding us. It was a dry, papery sound, like thousands of tiny things moving through the undergrowth. I strained my eyes, trying to see what was making the noise, but the shadows were too deep, the undergrowth too dense. "What's that sound?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She'd heard it too. "I don't know," I croaked, my throat suddenly dry. "Animals, maybe." But it didn't sound like animals. It sounded wrong, unnatural. The rustling intensified, swirling around us, closing in, and then I saw that not animals, plants. The miner's lettuce. But not just the small patch we'd found earlier. Everywhere. Blanketing the forest floor, spreading up the trunks of the redwoods, a carpet of green discs, pulsing, writhing, like they were alive, and they were moving, creeping, crawling, flowing towards us, the rustling sound growing into a dry, papery hiss. "Jakey, what is that?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. She stumbled back, tripping over a root, falling to the ground. I tried to pull her up, but my legs felt like lead. The nausea was overwhelming now, a tidal wave of sickness threatening to drown me. And the cramps were unbearable, tearing through me, twisting my guts into knots. The miner's lettuce was closer now, the leading edge of the green tide just a few feet away. I could see them clearly now, the individual leaves, no longer just dips, but shapes. Distorted, grotesque shapes. Some were vaguely face-like, with tiny black dots that might have been eyes. Others were hand-like, with stubby, twitching fingers. And they were covered in a fine, glistening slime. And then I understood. It wasn't just the miner's lettuce. It was the salmonberries too. And maybe other plants I hadn't even noticed. Plants I had unknowingly ingested along with my foraged snacks. They weren't just poisonous. They were something else. Something hungry. The first of the miner's lettuce reached us, crawling over Sarah's fallen leg. She screamed, scrambling back, kicking at the plants, but they were everywhere now, surging forward, a living carpet of green horror. I felt them on my boots. Crawling up my legs, the papery rustling now a deafening roar. The cramps intensified, becoming something beyond pain, a searing, internal agony, as if my own insides were being consumed. I looked down at my hands and saw them. Small, green shoots erupting from my skin, tiny leaves unfurling, pulsing with sickly green light. The plants were inside me now, growing, taking root, feeding. And I knew with a chilling certainty that this wasn't just food poisoning. This was transformation. I was becoming part of the forest. The forest was consuming me. Sarah was screaming, thrashing, trying to tear the plants off her legs, but it was no use. They were too many, too strong, clinging to her, burrowing into her. I watched, paralyzed by pain and terror, as the green tide engulfed her, her screams fading into choked gasps, then silence. And then there was only the rustling of the plants feeding, growing, consuming. And the faint, metallic tang of salmonberries lingering on my tongue, a final, bitter taste of my own foolishness. The last thing I saw, before the green tide closed over my eyes, was a single salmonberry, lying on the forest floor, glowing with an unnatural orange light. It looked almost appetizing. And then there was only darkness. And the rustling. Forever. Story 10, my name is Alex, and I've always considered myself a pretty seasoned hiker, not like Everest-conquering granola bar for breakfast, lunch, and dinner seasoned, but more of a weekend warrior type. The kind who enjoys a good trek through the woods, breathing in the fresh air, and snapping a few nature pics for the gram. I live for that disconnect from the digital world, that feeling of being immersed in nature, even if it's just for a day or two. I've tackled trails in the Rockies, ambled through the Appalachians, and even sweated my way up a few volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest. Each hike, big or small, always felt like a personal victory, a mini adventure etched into the story of my life. But there's one hike, just one single, ill-fated trek, that stands out from all the others. Not for the breathtaking views or the invigorating challenge, but for a different reason altogether. It's the hike I try not to think about, the one that still sends a shiver of unease down my spine whenever it creeps into my memory. It wasn't an encounter with a bear, or a sudden blizzard, or even getting hopelessly lost. No, it was something far more insidious, something that started with a seemingly insignificant detail: my shoes. It was supposed to be a guy's weekend. Me, my buddy Chris, and his cousin Mike. We were all feeling the city grind, the relentless pace of work and life, and we desperately needed an escape. Chris, ever the outdoorsy one, suggested a trail he'd heard about, the Devil's Tooth Trail in the Blackwood Forest. I know, even the name sounds ominous now, but back then, it just sounded intriguing. Blackwood Forest was a few hours' drive, known for its dense woods, challenging terrain, and supposedly stunning panoramic views from the summit. Perfect, we thought. A little bit of a challenge, a lot of nature, and some much-needed male bonding. We planned it out over beers one Friday night, poring over trail maps online and excitedly talking about conquering the Devil's Tooth. Chris, the experienced one, rattled off a list of essentials: backpacks, water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, compass, the whole shebang. Mike and I, nodding along, assured him we were fully prepared. In my mind, prepared meant grabbing my old backpack, throwing in some snacks, and making sure my phone was fully charged for photos. Yeah, I know. Classic amateur move. The morning of the hike dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that just begs you to be outside. We met up at Chris's place, piled in his SUV, and set off, the anticipation buzzing in the car. Chris and Mike were decked out in proper hiking gear: sturdy boots, moisture, wicking clothes, trekking poles. I, on the other hand, I hadn't really given my attire much thought. I grabbed a comfortable shirt, some jeans, and my trusty old sneakers. They were comfortable, right? I'd worn them for years. They were practically molded to my feet: hiking shoes, boots. Now, sneakers would be fine, I reasoned. Big mistake. As we pulled into the trailhead parking lot, the reality of my footwear choice started to sink in. Looking around, everyone else was sporting serious hiking boots, the kind that looked like they could withstand a nuclear blast. My old, faded sneakers suddenly felt inadequate. Chris glanced down at my feet, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Dude, those are sneakers," he stated, a hint of concern in his voice. "Yeah. What about it? They're comfy." Tried shrugging to play it cool, but a tiny seed of doubt had already been planted. "Devil's Tooth Trail is pretty rough, man. Lots of rocks, and even terrain. You sure those are gonna hold up?" Chris asked, genuinely worried. "Relax, I'll be fine. I've hiked in these before." I lied a little too confidently. I hadn't. Not on anything remotely resembling Devil's Tooth Trail, judging by the trailhead sign depicting a jagged, menacing-looking mountain peak. Mike, ever the optimist, clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Alex. We'll take it slow. If your feet start complaining, we'll turn back, no biggie." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they did little to quell the growing unease in my stomach. As we started down the trail, the initial path was relatively smooth, a gentle incline through sun-dappled woods. For the first few minutes, my sneakers felt okay, comfortable even. See, I thought to myself, Chris was just being overly cautious. But then the trail started to change. The smooth dirt path gave way to a rocky, uneven surface. Loose stones crunched underfoot, and the incline steepened. My sneakers, designed for pavement and leisurely strolls, began to protest. I could feel every sharp rock, every jutting root, pressing against the soles of my feet. The thin fabric offered little support, and my ankles started to wobble with each step. "So, how are those sneakers holding up?" Chris asked, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Peachy," I grunted, trying to maintain a cheerful facade, even as a sharp pain shot up from the ball of my foot. Just breaking them in, Mike chuckled. Breaking them in. Alex. They look like they're about to break apart. I forced a laugh, but inside, panic was starting to set in. We were barely a mile into the trail, and my feet were already screaming. The beautiful forest around me, the crisp morning air, the camaraderie with my friends, it all started to fade into the background, replaced by the relentless, agonizing awareness of my terrible shoe choice. This wasn't just uncomfortable, this was a disaster waiting to happen. And as the trail climbed higher, deeper into the ominous blackwood forest, I had a sinking feeling that my bad decision was about to become a whole lot worse than just sore feet. The trail didn't just get rockier, it felt like it was actively trying to punish me for my footwear fox pass. Loose gravel shifted underfoot, threatened to send me sprawling. Jagged stones, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves, jabbed mercilessly into the soles of my sneakers. Each step became a calculated risk, a mini ordeal of pain and precarious balance. I tried to adjust my gait, walking on the sides of my feet, trying to find patches of softer ground, but it was no use. The Devil's Tooth Trail was determined to make me suffer. My initial attempts at bravado had long since crumbled. The peachy facade was gone, replaced by a grimace of discomfort that I couldn't quite mask. Chris and Mike, bless their hearts, had slowed their pace, though I could see glances of concern exchanged between them. They offered words of encouragement, suggestions to take breaks, even offered to share their water, but there was nothing they could do about my idiotic shoe choice. This was my cross to bear, or rather, my rocks to hobble over. The forest itself seemed to close in around us as we climbed higher. The sunlight, which had dappled the initial part of the trail, grew thin and weak, barely penetrating the dense canopy of ancient trees. The air grew heavy still and strangely silent. The usual sounds of the woods' birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant chatter of squirrels, seemed to have vanished, replaced by an unnerving quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt expectant, like the forest itself was holding its breath waiting for something. And then I started to hear things. At first it was subtle, easily dismissed as the rustling of leaves or the creak of branches in the wind. But as we climbed deeper, the sounds became more distinct, more deliberate. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across bark, just at the edge of hearing. A low, guttural murmur too deep to be the wind, too indistinct to be any animal I recognized. I'd stop, listen intently, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds would fade, leaving only the oppressive silence in their wake. "You guys hear that?" I asked, my voice a little too loud in the stillness. Chris and Mike stopped, cocking their heads, listening. "Hear what? Just the woods, man." Chris replied, shrugging. "Yeah, maybe a bird or something," Mike added, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. I knew it wasn't birds. It wasn't the wind. These were sounds that resonated deeper than that, sounds that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Setting my teeth on edge, I didn't press the issue, not wanting to sound like a paranoid fool, but the sounds persisted, weaving themselves into the fabric of the silence, a constant, unsettling undercurrent to our increasingly painful ascent. My feet were now in open revolt. Blisters had formed on my heels, and the balls of my feet burned with each step. Every rock, every root, felt like it was designed to inflict maximum pain. I stumbled frequently, my ankles twisting and protesting. I was slowing us down, I knew it, but stopping for too long would only make it worse. The muscles in my legs were starting to cramp, compensating for lack of support in my ankles and the unnatural way I was walking. We pressed on, driven by some stubborn, misguided sense of male pride, or perhaps just a refusal to admit defeat. The trail grew steeper, the rocks larger and more treacherous. At one point, I slipped on a loose patch of scree. My ankle twisting sharply, I cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain, and stumbled, catching myself on a nearby tree just before I went down. "Alex, you okay?" Chris was instantly at my side, his face etched with concern. Yeah, just twisted my ankle a bit," I gasped, trying to wave him off, but the pain was searing. Mike joined us, his usual optimism replaced by a worried frown. "Dude, maybe we should turn back. This is getting pretty gnarly and your feet are clearly killing you." The thought of turning back was tempting, incredibly so. The summit, with its promised panoramic views, suddenly seemed a million miles away, a cruel, unattainable mirage. But the thought of admitting defeat, of being that guy who ruined the hike because of his stupid shoes at Stung. Pride, that insidious, idiotic human trait, reared its ugly head. No, I'm fine. Just need a minute, I insisted, leaning heavily on the tree, trying to catch my breath and ignore the throbbing in my ankle and the agonizing burn in my feet. Let's just keep going. We're probably almost there, right? I asked, desperately seeking reassurance. Chris pulled out the trail map his bro furrowed as he studied it. Alex, we're maybe halfway, if that. Halfway. Halfway up this tortuous, rocky incline, with my feet feeling like they were being slowly pulverized. Halfway, with the unsettling sounds of the forest growing more insistent, more present. Halfway, with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with my physical discomfort, and everything to do with a primal, instinctual feeling that we were not alone, that we were being watched, that the Devil's Tooth Trail was not just a challenging hike, but something else entirely, something hungry. As if to punctuate my growing dread, the scraping sound returned, closer this time, sharper, more insistent. It was no longer at the edge of hearing, it was right there, just beyond the trees, a rhythmic, chilling rasp that sent a fresh wave of goosebumps prickling across my skin. And this time, I wasn't the only one who heard it. Chris and Mike exchanged a look, a flicker of something in their eyes that mirrored the cold dread creeping into my own heart. The silence of the forest had been broken, replaced by a sound that was far more terrifying than silence ever could be. And we were only halfway there. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, morphing from a distant rasp into a rhythmic, dragging scritch that seemed to vibrate through the very ground we stood on. It was joined by a new sound, a wet, sucking noise, like something heavy being pulled through mud, adding a nauseating layer to the already unsettling soundscape. The forest, once silent and expectant, was now alive with these grotesque noises, and the air itself felt thick with a palpable sense of dread. What the hell is that? Mike whispered, his voice tight with fear, finally acknowledging the sounds that had been plaguing me. Even Chris, usually the unflappable one, looked pale, his eyes darting nervously into the deepening shadows of the woods. I don't know, I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. My ankle throbbed, my feet burned, but those physical pains were now overshadowed by a deeper, more primal fear. This wasn't just a tough hike gone wrong. This was something else entirely, something unnatural. The scritch intensified in the wet, sucking sound grew closer, and then I saw it. A movement in the periphery, a flicker of something dark and elongated between the trees, just beyond the edge of the trail. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the shadows. But the image seared itself into my mind. Something tall and possibly thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, and dragging something heavy. Do you see that? I gasped, pointing towards the spot where I'd seen the movement. Chris and Mike strained their eyes, peering into the gloom. See what? I didn't see anything, Chris said, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt at bravado. There was something there tall, dark, dragging something. I insisted, my voice rising in pitch. I swear I saw it. Mike took a step back, his eyes wide. Okay, dude, you're freaking me out. Maybe it's just shadows. Or a deer. Dragging a branch or something. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. But I knew it wasn't a deer. It wasn't shadows. It was something else. Something that was making those awful sounds. Something that was now, undeniably, moving closer. The scritch was louder now, right on the edge of the trail. And the sucking sound was wet and heavy, like dragging a waterlogged corpse. And then the smell hit us. A cloying, sickly sweet odor, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic. Something chemical. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger with each passing second, filling our nostrils, coating our tongues with a taste of decay and something indescribably foul. Jesus Christ, what is that smell? Chris gagged, covering his mouth and nose with his shirt. Mike stumbled back, retching. Smells like death, he choked out, his face green. The smell, the sounds, the fleeting glimpse of something dark and unnatural, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. We were not alone on this trail. And whatever it was close. Too close. My feet, forgotten for a moment in the surge of adrenaline, screamed in protest as I instinctively took a step back. The pain was excruciating, but I barely registered it. Survival instinct had kicked in, overriding everything else. We had to get out of there. Now, run. I yelled the word ripped from my throat, raw with fear. Run now, don't look back. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and bolted down the trail, ignoring the agony in my feet, driven by a primal terror that propelled me forward. Chris and Mike were right behind me, their footsteps pounding on the rocky path, a frantic counterpoint to the scritch that was now definitely, undeniably, pursuing us. We ran blindly, stumbling, tripping, scrambling over rocks and roots, the forest blurring into a green and brown tunnel around us. The smell of decay was thick in the air, choking us, and the scritch was relentless, gaining on us, each rasping sound a hammer blow against our sanity. I risked a glance back, a foolish, desperate move, and what I saw sent a jolt of pure terror through me. It was there behind us, emerging from the trees, no longer a fleeting shadow, but a horrifying reality. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, gaunt, like a skeletal figure draped in rotting flesh. Its limbs were elongated, grotesquely jointed, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural shuffle, dragging something heavy and shapeless behind it, leaving a glistening trail of something on the rocks. Its head was obscured by shadow, but I saw 2 points of light, burning like embers in the darkness, fixed on us, hungry, predatory. And then I understood the scritch. It wasn't dragging something, it was dragging itself. Its impossibly long fingers, tipped with claws like rusted iron, scraped against the rocks, propelling it forward with horrifying speed. I didn't need to tell Chris and Mike to run faster. They had seen it too. The sounds of their panicked breathing, their desperate footfalls, mingled with my own ragged gasps, creating a symphony of terror that echoed through the haunted woods. We were running for our lives, pursued by something that shouldn't exist, something that was born of nightmare and shadow, and all because of a stupid, avoidable mistake. The wrong shoes. It all came down to the wrong shoes. We burst out of the dense woods and into a small clearing, a patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy. The scritch faltered, the smell of decay lessened, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I dared to hope we had escaped, that we had outrun whatever that thing was. But then, as we stumbled in the clearing, I saw what lay ahead. The trailhead parking lot, the promise of safety, of escape, was there, just a short distance away. But between us and the parking lot, blocking our path, was a figure. Standing motionless in the center of the clearing, bathed in the weak sunlight, was another one of them. Taller, even thinner than the one that had chased us. This one stood erect, its head still obscured by shadow, but those burning ember eyes were unmistakable. It was waiting for us, anticipating us, and in its hand impossibly long, grotesquely thin fingers curled around something familiar. I squinted, my eyes blurring with exhaustion and terror, trying to make out what it was holding. And then I saw it clearly. Dangling limply from its grasp, swaying gently in the breeze, were sneakers. Old, faded, familiar sneakers. My sneakers. The ones I had worn on this ill-fated hike. The wrong shoes. And as I stared, paralyzed by a horror that transcended understanding, the figure in the clearing raised my sneakers, slowly, deliberately, and then, in a voice that was like nails on a chalkboard, a voice that scraped against my very soul, it spoke. You shouldn't have worn the wrong shoes. And that's the last thing I remember clearly. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of pain, shadow, and that horrific, rasping voice. I woke up in a hospital bed. Days later, my feet bandaged, my ankle in a cast, my mind a swirling vortex of fragmented memories and unspeakable dread. Chris and Mike were there, shaken, but alive. We told the authorities about what happened, about the creature, about the sounds, about the smell. They listened politely, nodded sympathetically, and attributed it to mountain lions. Stress-induced hallucinations, exhaustion. But we knew what we saw. We knew what we heard. We knew what we smelled. And we knew with a chilling certainty that it all started with a simple, stupid mistake. The wrong shoes. I still hike sometimes, but never in sneakers, never in Blackwood Forest, and never ever without checking my footwear 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Because sometimes the scariest monsters aren't bears or mountain lions or getting lost in the woods. Sometimes the real horror is the consequences of our own bad decisions, amplified by something ancient and hungry, lurking just beyond the edge of the trail, waiting for us to make a mistake. waiting for us to wear the wrong shoes.